Good morning. I'm Doug Apple, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. I'd like to welcome you today to this meeting of the board. This is the fourth meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings that determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing on or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2025, and on or before September 30th, 2026. I'll now take a roll call. Please respond if present. Hennis Aquino.
Present.
Alex Armlovich.
Present.
Rob Ehrlich.
Present.
Arpit Gupta.
Present.
Reed Jordan.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Christina Smith.
Present.
Adon Sotran. Not present. And Doug Apple, I am indeed present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The next planned meeting for this board will be the preliminary vote for rent-stabilized lease adjustments, which will be held on Wednesday, April 30th. This in-person meeting will start at 7 p.m., be held at LaGuardia Performing Arts Center at LaGuardia Community College in Long Island City, Queens. Doors will open at 6 p.m. If you plan to attend, use the entrance on Van Dam Street at that intersection of 47th Avenue. We encourage you to arrive early to avoid delays and help speed the entry of the public. This meeting will also be streamed live via YouTube. Information regarding this meeting is posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meetings section. We are planning 4 public hearings for the public to comment on the proposed guidelines. Hearings will be held in Queens on June 5th at the Jamaica Performing Arts Center, in Brooklyn on June 9th in the theater at the New York City College of Technology, in the Bronx on June 12th in the main theater at Hostos Community College, and in Manhattan on June 17th at Symphony Space at 96th Street and Broadway. These hearings will be held in the evenings beginning at 5 p.m. If you're interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on the RGB email updates under quick links. And also, just in terms of the public meetings, they are on our website, correct, Andrew? Okay, great. Proposed language for the apartment and hotel orders were emailed to board members yesterday, and there are copies in this proposed language in your meeting folder. You also find in your folder the prepared historical data tables that were circulated to the board past Monday. In addition, there's also a follow-up memo regarding additional data requested during last week's presentation of the 2025 PIOC data. Today's meeting will begin with our tenant panel, which is scheduled to go on until 12:15. The board will take a break from 12:15 to 1, and then in the afternoon, the owner panel will go till 3:30 or whatever we're finished. And a reminder to the board members that the annual conflicts of interest disclosure is required by May 2nd. Are we ready with the tenant panel? Do we have, I'm going to turn to Hennis to help organize this and call people up. Do you want to get started? Do you want to?
Yeah.
So do you want to start with?
Okay. So I'll first call Larry Woods testify. With Good at Riverside Law Project.
Welcome, Larry.
The button. There we go. Okay, the show starts. I always like to start by thanking the board members for their service, because you have largely a thankless job. Landlords and tenants alike vilify you. And you have to do a one-size-fits-all rent increase when there's so many different factors that come into play. You know, some buildings really are distressed. Many buildings are hugely profitable. But that's the cards you're dealt, and you have to make the best of it. So, and I really also want to thank the staff. I know Brian, Andrew, Charmaine, and Danielle do a lot of work on research and data all year long. But we do need a better system to figure this out. So if you're new, you might wonder why there has been a rent freeze for SROs for 12 years in a row. We certainly hope we can get that for apartment tenants. And there is, what is unique about SROs, what is an SRO, how many's left. So I'm going to quickly try to go over the history, but really the issue is the current conditions and the documentation we have that these buildings are hugely profitable. They generate a lot of income, and not from the rent-stabilized tenants, because there are the uses of the building, and that's why they've warranted a rent freeze for all these years. So I want to start with if you look at the one that says testimony with my name on it. The first page there, I will send this to Andrew, so the links that you see are live, so you don't have to type them in. But the one item I gave you as a hard copy, the pictorial history of SROs. It was done by a graphic artist a number of years ago. I thought it was a great illustration of the history of SROs across the country. Within the packet, this next 3 pages are going to be a historic timeline of SROs from the late 1800s. And if you read through it at some point, you'll see that, the rise and fall of SROs after World War I, dividing up a lot of buildings because of a housing shortage. Again, after World War II. Even in the 1930s, the Community Service Society advocated for the legalization and bringing up to code the illegal SROs that were created in the 1930s. And we're in a similar state now. There's probably more, I know there are more illegal SROs in subdivided buildings than there are legal SROs left in New York City. So this is an interesting, history if you go through that. Also among those links in terms of history, there's a link to the history of supported housing, because the only thing that has preserved this form of housing is having a nonprofit acquire it and maintain it as supportive housing, which social workers on site. And then there's also a link to a short video. Goddard Riverside actually developed a model of supported housing. In 1983-84, we acquired Capitol Hall on West 87th Street. It was before supported housing existed. And then the Supportive Housing Network of New York started out as the SRO provider group. Once Goddard Riverside, Catholic Charities, West Side Federation for Senior Housing, and other nonprofits started acquiring SROs. We hosted the SRO provider group, got a foundation grant, and it spun off and became the Supportive Housing Network of New York. So that's all the history, and I invite you to take a dive into those links and the reports to get more information. And there's a great book that was written by Brian Sullivan, formerly at Mobilization for Youth. He's now at Mobilization for Justice, actually was the name. He's now at the Legal Aid Society. But he has a whole book, it's called The Origins and Dimensions of a Crisis, so you could really do a deep dive as necessary there. So the next item we really want to bring to your attention is, after those 3 pages of history, there's a notice of rights and duties in your packet there. And the key thing about this is how tenants, residents, and SROs become protected by rent stabilization. There's something called we always called it the transiency loophole, which we had advocated since the early 80s to close. We're never successful. But it was built into the law from the inception in late 1969 and early 70s when rent stabilization was being put into effect. So in an SRO, when you move in, you're considered a transient tenant, unless the landlord's giving you a lease from the get-go. But they're supposed to give you a notice saying you have a right to become a rent-stabilized tenant. You do that by staying there for 6 months. You automatically are then deemed a permanent tenant. Or you do what's called the lease request. And this is spelled out in this DHCR document that is never handed out to tenants, but some tenants know this. And it's not a request and you don't get a lease. It actually triggers your rights to become a permanent tenant under the law. And then there's no leases that get renewed each year. They're just statutory tenants. So this has allowed, though, SRO owners, they don't want to rent to stabilized tenants. They're far more lucrative to rent to tourists, to rent to colleges, or to rent out to the city for different programs. The Department of Homeless Services, HASA, and they pay a lot of money, much more than they're going to get from a rent-stabilized tenant. So a lot of landlords do heavy screening to make sure nobody does a lease request. So if they're renting to tourists, they want to see your ticket that you're going back to Japan or Germany or wherever you may be, visiting. So you're not going to be somebody who triggers a lease request. And I know in the past, some former members have said, if we don't give any rent increase, what's the incentive for owners to maintain the rent stabilized units? The problem is, you could do 100% rent increase. You can double those rents. It's still not going to compete for the rent they can get from net leasing to colleges or tourists or those special needs placements by the city. So this is the transient loophole, and this is why these buildings have become so profitable. The next page on the bottom there just talks about the jurisdiction and when a hotel and SRO became subject to rent stabilization. And it was basically if rents were below $350 a month or $88 a week as of May 31st, 1968. So that's just a little background for you. The next page is from the hotel order from last year. I just wanted to point out under the definitions, there are 5 forms of SRO. And you actually can do a different guideline for each form of SRO housing. They're the residential hotels. They were known as apartment hotels. They actually have Class A multiple dwellings on their C of O, but they had hotel services. They might have had a switchboard operator, maid service. I don't know if there's any left, honestly, but that was one form. Rooming houses, a Class B, those are less than 30 units. They tend to be smaller buildings. It could be 6, 8, 10 units, a lot of 1 or 2 family homes that got broken up into rooming houses over time. Then there's single-room occupancy buildings that were built as such, or broken up under Section 248. A lot of apartments were broken up legally into SRO units, but that was outlawed in 1955. So the SROs that are left are all been created before 1955. Except a nonprofit can build an SRO, like a dormitory, universities. Dormitory is basically an SRO, it's another type. This is a Class B hotel, and then the bottom of the barrel was the lodging houses that used to exist down in the Bowery and other areas around the city. And people literally lived in cubicles with a chicken wire ceiling. Very few left, and they had some great names. I like the Terminal in Hell's Kitchen. What a name. The next page here, well, let me just double check here. Yeah. The next page I'm going to refer to later, but it's also from last year's explanatory statement, and it's the total number of units registered as rent stabilized with DHCR. And you can see how it's each year a couple thousand more units are lost. The remaining tenants in SROs tend to be seniors. For those who are still left, it's like a naturally recurring retirement community, except that their neighbors can be tourists or city placements or, the college students. So I want to, let's see. Yeah. The next page there is the summary chart of the Rent Guideline Board increases granted. And you can see that was in 2012 was the last time an increase was permitted. But one thing I want to point out is in the years that there was a guideline increase, there were provisos, there were conditions that the owner had to abide by in order to qualify for the increase. We've had different types of provisos for SROs going back to 1984. The initial one was warehousing. We made an argument if a landlord's emptying a building, if it's half empty, they want to increase their rent roll, rent up the building first, and then you could qualify for the rent increase. So warehousing has been one of the provisions. If a landlord, the percentage had varied from 40% warehoused, it's gotten smaller and smaller over the years. The other provisos have to do with how many units are still rent stabilized in the building. And if there's a high percent of non-stabilized rentals, in other words, the owner's getting a lot of rental income from the other sources, not from stabilized tenants, the feeling was generating a lot of income. It was a profitable building. It didn't warrant an increase for those remaining SRO tenants. So that's why there's been zero all those years, and in the years a proviso, an increase was granted to provisos protected tenants in certain situations. And then a last set of information in here I want to refer to. It's kind of a snapshot. It's gotten a little dated, but it gives you a good picture. Community Board 7 on the Upper West Side had a study on the SROs in Community Board 7, running from 59th to 110th Street. And I should prefix this by saying that, in terms of the total numbers, in 1971, there was 165,000 units of SRO housing left. But with J51 and other incentives to demolish and convert the buildings, and landlords kind of in the 1970s, it was a pretty Wild West situation with a lot of heavy-handed harassment. And in 1979, there was an SRO, Tenants' Rights Coalition, and they, through Mayor Koch, they demanded and got funding for the creation of the West Side and the East Side SRO law projects. And in 1981, Goddard Riverside opened up the West Side SRO law project. I joined the staff in '87, so I've been working with SRO tenants from the 1980s. But in 1987, there was the Blackburn Report. There was a one-year moratorium on the demolition and conversion of SROs. The city realized as they were demolishing SROs, homelessness was growing rapidly, and they said, let's do a timeout on destroying this housing. And then the Blackburn Report documented we had 65,000 units left. So from 71 through 87 or 86, 2/3 of the stock, 100,000 units basically were destroyed. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why people were sleeping on a Broadway mall. The bulk of the SROs were in this Manhattan. 60% of the stock in the city were in Manhattan. A lot of them were concentrated on the Upper West Side in Hell's Kitchen. That's the bigger hotels. A lot of the rooming houses are in Harlem, Chelsea, other areas of the city, and certainly outside in the outer boroughs. How many are left now? We guesstimate 25,000, 30,000. And the ones that are left and are fully occupied are the ones been acquired by nonprofit organizations and preserved as supported housing. So this little snapshot, the questions were how many SROs are left, why are they important, how are they used, how many are used by tourists, how many are used for city social service placements. And at that time, 15 years ago, they found a little 13,000 SRO units in Community Board 7. Again, that's between 59 and 110. The next graph, the little pie chart, I'm sorry it's not in color, so I put in the letters for you. The legal hotel use, D, 3,200 units, is pretty small. You can see it's almost the market-driven. The tourists, the colleges, or the city placements were almost twice the number. We were also surprised to see servants in some of the fancy apartments, the top floor that had SRO units for servants. Not considered an SRO, but they counted those units in this count as well. So these next couple of pages just document how many SRO units were lost. They did that through the certificates of non-harassment that landlords have to get before they can get permits to convert. So you can just see some of the different charts of lost units, units converted back to 1 or 2 family homes in the case of rooming houses. The next page here, the nonprofit SROs. At that point in time, there were 17 buildings preserved as supported housing. That's clearly grown. We're actually going to do a ribbon-cutting ceremony on the Russo residence at 235 West 107th Street in June. And we just took over administration of a transitional shelter in the Pennington on 95th Street that just opened up about 2 months ago. We're just filling it up now. And many other buildings are for sale or we're looking to acquire, us, West Fish, and many others. Many of these buildings during the pandemic, when folks had to be getting out of the congregate shelters, or more recently with the asylum seekers, a lot of the buildings filled up and were making a lot of money. Now with the the people being taken out of the hotels and some of these buildings are nearly empty, owners are looking to sell some of them. And we are definitely trying to acquire them so we can preserve them. Whether we're going to have capital money and rent subsidies, because what's happening in Washington is a big question, which is frightening the hell out of a lot of us who care about creating and preserving affordable housing. Let's see, what I'll finish with. Again, I want to thank Andrew and Brian and the others for their work on trying to produce some data, and they've produced a series of memos and reports over the years, so Andrew can get you the full set of copies of these. But what's interesting about these is you can see the mean and median incomes for the SROs continue to go up year after year after year, despite a 13-year rent freeze.
You mean rents?
Rents,
I mean,
yes.
You said income, but
Oh.
the rents
Thank you, Andrew.
are increasing.
I stand corrected. One of the things I thought was interesting in one of the memos, I think it was the back of this one, was that the increase seemed to coincide with the 1 and 2 year lease increases for rent-stabilized apartments. So some SRO owners took the apartment increases in lieu of not getting an increase through the SROs. But the median rents are quite high. If you look at the data, and if you think about these units on a square foot basis, they're much cheaper to operate when you have 6 people sharing a bathroom. And on a square foot basis, a lot more income is generated than you get through apartments, especially when you add in the income from the non-stabilized rentals that occur in many of these buildings. There's a lot of data in these memos that show the huge percent that are exempt and not reported. I was really struck with some of the data about DHCR where there were close to 8,000 units registered with DHCR, but looking at Department of Finance and HPD data, there were actually 23,000 units. So in the case of the SROs, only 35% of the units were registered as stabilized, and then even the units that were stabilized, many of them were registered as exempt or vacant. So it was, of that 35% were registered as stabilized, only 40% actually had a rent-stabilized tenant in them. So it just reflects the small numbers of tenants that remain in a lot of these buildings. So for all those reasons, we're asking you that you grant those remaining permanent tenants continued reprieve from rent increases, because many of them do have high rent burdens, despite the rent freeze being in effect for so long. Thank you. I should conclude. There's another submission you have from the SRO Law Project. You should have it in the packet up there. That's the written testimony from Goddard Riverside, the current staff at the Law Project. So they cite more specific examples in buildings that document what I've just relayed to you.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Questions?
Larry. Any questions for Larry? Go ahead, Alex.
Thanks, Larry. One question. On page 9, you show the total number of registered units, and the handwriting you show it for 2024, that the number of units dropped from 15,991 in 23 to just 10,675 in 24. This is the bottom of page 9. Understand that, that's gigantic.
Yeah, that was the newest.
Drop.
Yeah, that's the newest report, the 2024 report. So I added that in to, this is the explanatory statement from last year's guideline. Yeah, there's a loss of 5,000 units were not registered. I honestly think it is people passing away or moving into nursing homes. I just know so many of those remaining seniors, that's what happens, because they're not younger tenants moving into these buildings. And there's still, people get bought out, people do want to relocate, or they get on waiting lists to move into Section 202 senior housing. I know several tenants who have moved into that form of housing because they do really want their own bathrooms.
So the law does allow, when a tenant moves out, whether they die or any other reason, to then convert that unit?
It's not a matter of
To no-
conversion. They're just not going to rent to somebody else who would do a lease request or trigger their right to become a stabilized tenant.
Right.
So they either keep it vacant,
Right.
There are colleges that net lease the buildings, AMDA, American Music Drama Academy. On West 85th Street, right next to me, they own 2 buildings, also the Stratford Arms on 70th Street.
So they're being generally slowly converted to other uses of the
Yeah,
units,
well,
right?
again,
And
they can generate
enough
so much more income not renting to a new rent-stabilized tenant. So it's
sure.
just an attrition process.
Yeah.
And it's, I think it's horrible. We fought to close what we called the transiency loophole, but we were not successful. So that's why we've lost all these units. But that's also why these buildings are so profitable.
One other question. So the leasing of these buildings by institutions or tourists, is that mostly the hotels as opposed to like rooming houses?
Well, it's a mix. Initially, the illegal hotels were largely in the hotels. But rooming house, I guess through like Airbnb and other online outfits, you can even rent units in rooming houses. It's not legal in a lot of cases. You're not supposed to do less than 30-day rentals. So there's still, part of the data that Andrew produced is the number of fines or violations for those short-term rentals. But that's it. Also, what happens in apartment buildings. It's not just SROs that you have the illegal rentals.
So just a point of clarification that if you rent one of these rooms in an SRO or rooming house, you have to wait 30 days before you can request a lease.
No, not from the inception.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's, if you look at the rider, it's anytime after.
Anytime.
You could rent it for a week
Okay.
and then trigger your right to become a stabilized tenant.
Okay. My mistake.
No, that's okay. No, the 30 days is when the illegal lockout law takes effect. If you've been in place for more than 30 days, you're entitled to due process before you
Got
get
it.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, as always, thank you very much, Larry, for coming.
Thank you, Doug.
For helping us understand this sort of important part of the portfolio. So thank you.
Okay.
Just from staff, we'll have a hotel report. We didn't get the data set to produce it before the preliminary vote, unfortunately, but we will have an update to the report in May.
Thank you.
Okay. Genesis, would you like to introduce our next speaker?
Yeah. So I will now call New York City Controller Brad Lander.
Thank you.
Just want to welcome the controller to, and I actually just want to mention that according to Andrew, who's the historian for the Rent Guidelines Board, this might be the first time we've had a controller speak at one of our meetings.
Like Larry, I've been here a very long time, from the 90s, and not at coming to a public meeting. We've had
Obviously at the.
at our public
borough,
hearings,
yeah.
but I think
So
may
thank
be
you for
prepared.
coming.
Well, I'm honored to be here. I'm fortunate to have worked with and know and engaged in dialogue with many of you. Chair, you and I go back a long way. And, first of all, I don't know if it's congratulations or condolences on being the chair of the Rent Guidelines Board, but it's respect. It is an important role. It's not an easy role, this board, and the chair of it for sure. But it's like a thing we're lucky to have in New York, and I'm grateful to all the board members, and I'm grateful to you for doing it. Thank you, Andrew, for all your long research and leadership on the staff level, and to all the members of the board. It's also actually quite an honor, this is not my testimony, but it's really an honor to follow Larry Wood, who I also am honored to have worked with for 30 years since I was at the Fifth Avenue Committee. And I was really struck by listening to his remarks, because we tend to think about, New Yorkers tend to think about the SRO stock as a kind of relic, something sort of like left to us from history and small and diminishing. And it could be such a significant part of our housing future, both because so much, on the market side, there is a real appetite, not just like student housing, as he mentioned, but there's developers like Common who would like to be building housing that was of this model. There's a real opportunity here. At the same time, if you ask New Yorkers, one of the biggest public safety problems, of course, they'll talk about folks with mental illness who are street homeless on the subways and stoops of our buildings. What do they need? They need SRO and supportive housing units. And by some estimates, there's about 2,000 people with serious mental illness who are unsheltered. And on any given day, 2,500 vacant SRO and rent stabilized units that they're not eligible for because our current policies say you've got to go to shelter. A lot of folks have had bad experiences in shelter, so they stay on streets and subways. If we made those units available using this housing first model, we could dramatically reduce street homelessness for people with serious mental illness. And then, of course, you want to grow the stock, but rather than thinking of it just narrowly and importantly through New York, and the supportive housing, it might be possible to think more expansively about preserving the stock we have, making some room for the market uses that want stock like this, while also carving out a more significant volume to do housing first, to make genuinely supportive housing. So thank you, Larry, for, and I'm really grateful that I got to hear that testimony. I think it's a powerful set of ideas. All right. Thank you to the RGB, as always, for your research, which provides important data on the health and conditions of the rent-stabilized housing stock, on the trajectory of rents, costs, net operating income, and on some of the challenges facing tenants and owners. For me, the broad goal has always been clear, given the housing emergency that, of course, is the underlying reason we have a rent stabilization system in the first place. We must keep rents as low as we possibly can while ensuring that units are well maintained, heat and services provided, supers paid, and essential costs covered. After reviewing the research reports compiled by the RGB for this year, I believe that a rent freeze is appropriate for the upcoming year, following 3 years of rent increases that have raised rents in total by nearly 9%. A few key metrics have led me to this recommendation. First, after adjusting for inflation, net operating income for owners grew by 8% from 22 to 23. That's a big turnaround and a welcome one in NOI over the past few years. As owners know too well, NOI declined from 19 to 20 and again from 20 to 21 during the pandemic, and then increased only modestly by 4% from 21 to 22. Those increases in NOI are consistent across the boroughs and by the percentage of rent-stabilized units. They're increasing in 83% of community districts across New York City. NOI is up 12% in buildings with at least one stabilized unit, and solidly increasing in buildings with 100% stabilized units, up 4.6% from 22 to 23. In that year, rental income increased an average of 6.9%, while operating costs rose an average of 3.8%. Operating costs are rising, of course, as the PIAC and other data shows, but rental income and NOI are rising twice as fast. Building distress, thankfully, this was one of the things I was most encouraged to see in the data, has declined for the first time since 2016, and rent collection is up in every single community district. One thing that reflects in that year, 22 to 23, I believe, is that the nearly $3 billion in emergency rental assistance funding helped tenants pay their rents and increased owners' ability to operate their buildings. And the rental properties have largely recovered financially since the pandemic. Now, there is a small but real issue with a handful of buildings, but a meaningful handful, facing ongoing distress. My office last year kind of used some of your research, did some research of our own, and put out a really detailed set of recommendations for how to approach that portion of the stock, where the tools need to be focused better. You know, IAIs are appropriate in some cases. Unlocking Doors program, if we could make it actually unlock it, holds a lot of promise. You know, there is a better way of combining state and city tools to bring relief to the target set of buildings where it's necessary, or where owners don't want to do that, to figure out a preservation ownership transfer. But I believe that is a important but finite universe of buildings, and it does not require across-the-board rent increases that would hit millions of tenants. At the same time, and this is critical, I mean, tenants continue to struggle mightily. More than 45% of rent-stabilized tenants are rent-burdened. Low-income tenants in particular struggle to keep up with rising inflation, as the CPI rose 3.8%, even as average inflation-adjusted wages declined slightly. Representation of tenants in housing court, which of course is not the responsibility of the RGB, but is a real issue, declined dramatically from a high of 71%. We had reached the point where Tenants, low and moderate income tenants facing eviction in housing courts, 71% were represented, but now it's down to about 42%, leaving so many tenants vulnerable. And again, the law doesn't say for you guys to look at that, but that's just the reality. As tenant income, as if rents go up, more tenants are going to wind up facing eviction for inability to pay. And by law, they're supposed to have a lawyer, but more than half of them aren't going to have one. This board's job is never easy, balancing the need to keep units affordable amidst a housing emergency with the need to ensure that there are sufficient resources to maintain building conditions. Back in 2015 and 2016, I advocated for and supported the board's decision to freeze rents. Over the past few years, coming out of the pandemic, I supported modest increases, though lower than the ones that were ultimately adopted. But this year, after 3 years of substantial increases that have hiked stabilized rents by 9%, I believe the evidence is clear. New York City is in the midst of a housing emergency, and tenants are struggling to make ends meet. The data laid out by the RGB demonstrates this year that landlords have the income they need to keep the heat on, make repairs, pay their supers a living wage, and keep their buildings well maintained. So I urge the board to freeze the rent in rent-stabilized apartments in the upcoming year to make the city a little more affordable to hardworking and too often struggling New York families. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be the first controller to come have this dialogue with you here. Chair, for you, I appreciate the calm of this setting relative to the tumult of later settings. On the other hand, I actually think it's like a great thing about the democratic system the whole thing sets up, which wants research to base data, which wants dialogue in kind of calm and small settings, and which welcomes input in robust and larger ones. And that is New York City, and we're lucky to have it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wonder if anybody, in the spirit of dialogue, if there are any questions anybody has for the controller? Arpit?
Thank you so much for coming here, Brad, and for your testimony. So I just want to highlight one number that we have in front of us from Andrew, which is that 28.8% of the PIOC weight comes from property taxes, right? So the city is doing two things simultaneously.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you're charging enormous quantities of property taxes onto these rent-stabilized buildings, and then you're creating this board, which is tasked with translating costs onto tenants. So, put bluntly, you want lower rents. There's a very easy avenue available to you, which is lower the property taxes, and we can follow through our mandate and pass those costs down to tenants.
Yeah.
Now, I appreciate the leadership that your team has done in highlighting the inequities of the property tax system, but I just wanted to put it out there in the spirit of debate, which is a very easy way for the city to lower these rents if they want to.
I agree with everything with you said, except for the words "very easy." But I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, and I share this point of view, and I'm an advocate for property tax reform. We just have this dual problem that simply lowering the rate across the board won't mostly lead to the benefit going to rent-stabilized building owners under the current system, and so we urgently need, but it is not very easy to get, property tax reform in Albany that would make the system fairer, that would automatically diminish the burden we estimate by as much as a third on multifamily residential buildings, simply by, even if you just in a revenue-neutral way over time, equalize within the residential class, much less if you propose a broader reform. So I agree with you entirely. I do think it's actually a good point you make, and I will continue to advocate at City Hall and in Albany that we reform the property tax system, including in a way that would make it fairer for the owners of multifamily residential rental buildings, so that we could bring that burden down. So I think it's entirely fair and appropriate.
Thanks.
Okay.
Just a quick comment. You mentioned there's no one-size-fits-all with respect to property taxes and fixing the system. We certainly talk about that here. There's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to rent increases either, right? Because we have pre-'74 stock, we have post-'74 stock, we have core Manhattan data mixed in with 100% rent stabilized in the outer boroughs. So that's something, your point is well taken. There is no one size fits all with respect to property tax reform. And it's something that the board needs to look at closer in terms of the buildings that are in distress are the outer boroughs that the data, it's like a big soup, controller.
Two things here. On the rental stock, in terms of how we look at, building income in distress, I agree. The rental stock in New York City is at a much wider scale than it was when this system was designed. I don't think the designers of the system would have imagined what luxury rentals look like today while people are still struggling. And yeah, for the distressed buildings, a much more tailored solution is needed than this board has access to the ability to do. And it would require HCR and HPD to work together, because some of that would get at rent roll, but much of that would get at the tax breaks and at targeted J51 and at the unlocking doors model and the deployment of vouchers. And, there's a whole set of tools that, relative to the stock, is a modest set of buildings, not that it's not significant. So I agree with that. That's really what we recommended last year, is like define that universe, and HCR and HPD should get together to make it easier to access the tools, from light touch ones like, an IAI, through medium touch ones like a package that would include unlocking doors and J51, to preservation ownership transfer to a nonprofit where the owner doesn't want to or is unable to maintain the building and the conditions that are required. So I think that would be better, and then you guys could focus on kind of broader conditions or have a little more ability to segment. I will say on property tax reform, even though the politics are hard, the principle is across residential property relatively more simple. I mean, buildings should be taxed at the same percentage of the value of the building. And we are so far from that right now. So there I would like, and I'm undertaxed in my row house in the South Slope because of a set of policies that have held increases down over the years. And I should pay the same percentage of the value of my home as a homeowner in Southeast Queens, but also as a residential rental building owner in Manhattan. And it's not 100% easy to compare a sales value to the value of a rental building, but it's not nearly so difficult as our system makes it. So that actually should be simple. I mean, I hear you on the property tax system for residential property in particular should be simpler. Everyone should pay the same, about 1% of the value of the property that they own. The politics are what's more complicated there, actually, I think, than the valuation. Last thing I'll say, just because I do think property taxes are an area where obviously the city and the state have very direct influence, but I did notice in the PI Act that insurance is just through the roof. And we'd known that already, but boy, this year's numbers were staggering, and these are a couple of years obviously lagging. The city, there is a public policy engagement that is needed here to figure out how to support insurance costs that can maintain the stock and keep it down. That's a little different than where like property taxes that we're directly charging, but I admire the work that John Crotty and before he died, Dick Ravitch were doing on this, and I think some public policy engagement to figure out how to support the insurance infrastructure here would be wise. We have a stock that just kind of doesn't exist elsewhere and in the same way, and so figuring out how we could support or enhance insurance would be a good idea.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brad. A lot of your presentation was based on the income and expense report, which covers 2023. Last week, we talked about data from last year, from 2024 into 2025, the PIOC, which showed a 6% roughly increase in operating cost, and also data on the sale of rent-stabilized housing, which shows a huge drop. It's about 30%, roughly speaking, in each of the last 2 years. And I'm curious what you make of the decrease in the prices of rent-stabilized housing.
Yeah. I mean, and the data lag is so hard, so I have sympathy. I mean, I know there's reform work underway to think about what you could do to kind of have more real-time information. And I will say a meaningful part of my recommendation does come from the fact that, like, that lag has its impacts. And so it was appropriate the last couple of years to award those increases, but now tenants have had them and they're really struggling. So I do think it's appropriate, even given the data you said, to say, okay, this year we're assigned to look back at that year, and given the lag in rent increases and NOI increases, we can give tenants a break this year. In terms of how to interpret the sales decline, I actually asked my team in the controller's office to dig in. We put a lot of housing data out in our monthly newsletter, and we did some looks at this stuff about a year ago. So I asked them to dig in and try to figure out what they could interpret, and I'll come back to you when we have some more information.
Hi, thanks, Fred. I wanted to ask you, as controller, you guys, acquired part of the, Signature Bank portfolio,
Yes.
And I have a sense that probably, as an equity owner, you probably get a clearer view. When we have questions about data, questions about reporting, if you are the owner, then you probably can get a direct look. Like, are the costs in that portfolio flat or down, or kind of how are the finances of?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me come back to you with that. We do, there's, for those of you that don't know, the New York City pension funds, at my recommendation, teamed up with Related and Community Preservation Corporation to buy the mortgages on the 35,000 roughly rent-stabilized units that were in the Signature Bank portfolio and were at risk when they failed. FDIC helped a lot and still holds the lion's share of that. And I will say broadly, it's going very well. I mean, we have been able to, most of the owners, there have been, quite few either, mortgage settlements or ownership transfer, and the vast majority of owners are servicing their mortgages. Everything remains stabilized. There are some, a small handful of situations where kind of workouts and investments were required. The transaction involves setting some dollars aside, but the vast majority of the buildings have been able just to kind of come up to mortgage payment, because there was a lot of delinquency just in the period as Signature was failing, and keep conditions strong. But I'm glad to ask the team there to put a memo together that looks at the questions that we're considering here. What can we learn from the participation that we have on what costs are on whatever, kind of like a little mini RGB analysis of that stock, where we just have a lot of information. I think it will be really illuminating for us and might be helpful to you guys. So it's a great idea, and I'll ask them to do it.
So we did actually get a presentation last week from CPC.
Oh, good. Okay, great.
I've talked to the president, who you know
Yes.
well. And his staff came and painted a little more of a cautionary picture. Pointed to some indication of distress. Again, that's, as you point out, a segment of the portfolio that may have been greater at risk to begin with, but did point out some real indicators of distress in that portion of the portfolio that did raise some concern. And we also got a presentation from, I know you know, the Furman Center, who came and talked about.
Yeah, I looked at Mark's testimony.
Yeah, exactly. So you saw what he did.
Yeah.
So there were roughly half, because you're right, this is, we're really talking about two different housing stocks, very different, where you have the sort of 80-20 versus the 100%, we like to call it the Bronx and Brooklyn stock. And I think, I guess my question to you is how you view a recommendation for a zero, which I fully understand and fully think it's a really, interesting way to think about it, in the context of the access to capital markets, what does appear to be some growing indicators of distress. I mean, there's no, buildings aren't yet falling down, though there was one, but there's no generalized. But how you see that in the context of really what may be coming down the pike, and really how do you get access to capital markets in the circumstances that you're thinking?
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess I think of it as for the recommendation I'm making in two ways. One is this kind of broad versus narrow. Like, there's the question of, like, what's the recommendation across all these struggling tenants? Because, again, 45% of rent-stabilized tenants are rent-burdened and really experiencing challenges against, a more modest set of the universe that needs targeted solutions. And it's not, you don't have those tools, but the government broadly has a lot of those tools. And then it's just an issue of over time, because, Mark's presentation spoke to kind of a long-term process by which, those conditions rose. Then you have this issue that over the last 3 years, there were relatively robust increases. And so to me, it's like, that's kind of what brings me to this, is I'm looking at the lag between, okay, so those things worked over the last few years to push NOI up. I see just enormous tenant suffering. To me, it seems for this year, what's appropriate is to kind of lean to the side of giving the tenants the ability to continue affording to live here. Know that you're going to continue to see rental income growth. I mean, last year, rental income growth was double the rent increases you granted. So it's not the case that doing a rent freeze would freeze the growth in rental income. It would, almost certainly go up by still the same 3 or 4% by which it exceeded the increases that were allowed last year. And people would still broadly have access to the capital markets across the part of the stock that is more market rate. For the targeted places, that's where targeted solutions are needed. I mean, that's why we did the investment with CPC and related. I'd love to put more pension fund capital into deals like that. Honestly, that is my favorite deal of any pension fund deal we've done. I mean, it helps when the FDIC takes 95% of the equity, so if you can get that on more deals, great. But even so, this is a really appropriate, deployment of pension fund dollars, and I think there's a lot more we could do there, targeted, especially at the distressed part of the stock. So.
Great, well, thank you.
Thank you. I
Thank
really
you for being
appreciate
here,
the
and
opportunity to
we
come
appreciate your testimony.
present to all of you today. Thanks very much.
I'll now call Charlie Dulick from Housing Conservation Coordinators.
I got some of these for you guys.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks. I've been coming to the public meetings for about 7 or 8 years, so if I, instinctively break out into chanting at some point, it's just how I've been programmed to think. But thank you for inviting me here to this meeting today. My name is Charlie Dulick. I am the Director of Organizing at Housing Conservation Coordinators. HCC is a 53-year-old Hell's Kitchen nonprofit. We support tenants across Manhattan's West Side, also in Chelsea and the Upper West Side, but mostly Hell's Kitchen. And our organization has 3 parts. We have a legal services department that works mostly on housing and public benefits assistance, also a couple other areas, but mostly, we're a right to counsel provider, defending folks in housing court, also filing proactive litigation, often around building conditions. We have a weatherization program that works with owners, installing energy efficient systems in low-income buildings. So certainly, are exposed to how to make those sorts of things work. And finally, our organizing team that I manage that supports tenants facing high rents, poor building conditions, harassment, other forms of instability. And, through these areas, HCC understands and I understand the multi-layered challenges confronting the city's housing stock, from legal challenges and frameworks governing it, to the cost of managing a building well and having money to make repairs, to the serious issues and intense precarity that residents face. And my testimony this morning is informed by these perspectives and my direct experience working closely with a diverse array of rent-stabilized tenants in core Manhattan. So, drawing upon all of that, I do want to urge the board to implement a rent freeze for rent-stabilized tenants, and we'll now get into a little bit of why I think that. So at HCC, we assist roughly 4,000 individuals and families a year. Probably most of these are in rent-stabilized units. And while our catchment area has slightly lower poverty levels and slightly higher average income than the average community district in the city, we still have really extreme rent burdens. About half of the tenants in our area are rent burdened. About a quarter, I think it's about 26%, are severely rent burdened. So even in an area that's doing relatively well, tenants are struggling. This means that the cost or the difficulty keeping up with the cost of rent increasingly cuts across income levels. As the Community Service Society put out in a recent study, middle income tenants are becoming the face of eviction rates, with rates up 27% in the post-pandemic period. And this is consistent with HCC's experience on the ground and my experience of who comes to us for help. It's now increasingly middle income tenants who are dealing with all the problems that other tenants have been dealing with for longer. So, one of the things that we do is we hold a weekly walk-in clinic, and anyone from across Manhattan can come in and receive advice on basic housing issues. And week after week, it hits, we literally have a line out the door of people coming from every part of the city, Upper East Side, Chinatown, Upper West Side, wherever. And we talk to these folks, and a lot of them may be what we would traditionally assume for tenants who are struggling, low income or folks on forms of public assistance. But, I talk to people who tell me their income, is a lot higher than that, who may pay significantly higher in rent. Certainly folks that I'll get into in a minute who are in the 80% of rent stabilized buildings, the 80% of 421A buildings who are paying like $4,000, $5,000 a month in rent, but it's rent stabilized for the duration of that tax abatement. Those folks are struggling a lot as well. Our legal team reports an increase in tenants facing eviction post-COVID. Also, folks applying for public assistance programs. A common one for tenants who have accrued rental arrears is HRA's one-shot deal. And, our legal services providers, our legal team reports that, like other legal services providers across the city, they're stretched thin, like the comptroller mentioned earlier. We're not really able to represent as many people in housing court as we would like to, or not even close to it. And our legal team also reports that the folks who they either represent or give advice to increasingly struggle to navigate the HRA. There's so many people applying. It's bureaucratically quite difficult for tenants to manage. And there's less money to go around to pay for these sorts of arrears. So the result then of high rent increases is like the comptroller mentioned, a growing strain on limited state resources, more and more tenants who fall through the cracks and either require HRA or another part of the city to pay their rent, or get evicted and add to cost the city will pay elsewhere. Unlike many other parts of the city, our catchment area contains not only a lot of pre-1974 rent-stabilized units, but a pretty significant portion of post-1974 units. A lot of big 421A buildings are on the west side. I was reading a report from the state comptroller last month that our area, Chelsea and Hell's Kitchen, gained the fourth most new housing units of any area in the city in the last 15 years. A lot of these, again, are large buildings receiving 421A tax breaks. And we're one of the only groups who really focuses specifically on organizing tenants in these buildings. And we try and do that to bring together both the lower income tenants who are in income restricted units and middle income tenants who are in non-restricted units. And, we hear a lot of the same things from both of those groups. Difficulty keeping up with the rents, regardless of what level those rents are set at. And this is an example I wanted to bring up of a young mom who lives in one of those 80% of non-income restricted units, who has come in actually the last few weeks to our walk-in clinic extremely distressed. In addition to the regular rent increases she pays, there's also a 2.2% surcharge that's added on as buildings receiving that abatement move closer and closer to the abatement expiring. And she just keeps coming back to ask, this can't be right. Like, this cannot be the numbers that I am being asked to sign. And I generally tell her that, in fact, they are at least, legally correct and accurate. And I was struck the other week when she, brought up her 8-year-old daughter and asked me how anyone could be expected to raise a family in one place if rents keep going up like that. And again, I was struck because that was a tenant who was paying significantly higher in rent, though a rent-stabilized tenant as well. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the building conditions HCC is seeing on the west side. Dug into your great 2025 income and expense report that provided a lot of important information for us thinking about what's going on in our catchment area. In the most recent longitudinal study of the Chelsea Clinton Community District, buildings with rent-stabilized units, rents rose 10.3%, while NOI rose 24%. On the Upper West Side, it's even greater. Rents rose 12%, while NOI went up 29.3%. That's the third steepest increase of any community district in the city. So certainly an area where landlords who have some rent-stabilized buildings seem to be collecting a lot more than they have been in the recent past. And yet tenants in these areas and in some of these buildings where we know the landlords to be doing quite well flock to us with stories of harrowing conditions. Rent-stabilized tenants of Daniel Ohab Shalom on 104 West 83rd Street who have dealt with mold and rodents and issues you might imagine, but also a live beehive in their walls for over a year, or 342 West 71st Street where tenants of the Tran Group have lived without gas for over 2 years, or a stretch of over a dozen buildings on West 49th between 8th and 9th owned by Black Spruce Management. There was a recent great report from WNYC and Gothamist that placed market rate rents in these buildings as high as $3,200 a month. There are also many stabilized units, and despite these relatively high rents, they face outrageously bad conditions. Everything you can imagine from pests and mold to lack of repairing buzzers and front door locks have led to a dangerous trespassing and squatting situation and even a homicide. And you would think, okay, maybe that landlord might not have the funds to be making repairs, and that's a reason why rent-stabilized rents should go up. But in 2020, they secured a $48 million tax break from the city with the express intent to fund repairs, and yet conditions have only worsened since then, racking up more than 1,400 housing violations in that time. And, I have no doubt that these are extreme examples that don't represent the entirety of buildings on the west side or buildings with rent-stabilized units on the west side. But, I think what they do have in common, just according to the income and expense report, is that landlords in core Manhattan are doing well, whether or not that's being passed on to the tenant experience. So, in conclusion, I think core Manhattan is obviously a different beast than the rest of the city, as has been brought up today. Its buildings are newer, taller, its portfolios are doing relatively better, at least in terms of NOI. Where it does not differ, though, is in the experience of tenants. Just like in the rest of the city, core Manhattan tenants across incomes face stagnant or falling wages, skyrocketing rates of rent burden, increasing threats of eviction, and deteriorating conditions in their home, even when landlords have millions on hand to make repairs. So, like the rest of the city's rent-stabilized tenants, those living in core Manhattan desperately need a rent freeze this year, and I urge you to grant them one. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Thank you.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks. I'm now called Joanne Grell from Community Action for Safe Apartments, CASA.
Great. Welcome, Joanne. Thank you
Hello,
for coming.
can you hear me? Okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, members of the board, new members of the board, new chairman. My name is Joanne Grell, and I am here as a tenant, as a parent, and as an advocate deeply rooted in the Bronx community. I'm a proud leader of CASA, Community Action for Safe Apartments, a tenant-led organization committed to ensuring New Yorkers have access to safe and affordable housing, and I want to thank you very much for allowing me to represent both CASA and rent-stabilized tenants across this great city. So today you'll hear, and you have already heard, a multitude of data, charts, percentages, and financial analyses. But my testimony is about the lived experiences behind those numbers, the stories of families like mine who are currently grappling with a topic that we never thought we would be grappling with, which is housing instability. A little bit about myself. I moved to the Bronx from Brooklyn when I separated from my husband. I was a single mother with 2 small children, ages 2 and 5, and no clue of how I would do it. But I was very fortunate to find a rent-stabilized apartment in the Bronx in Pelham Bay. And that was 23 years ago, and I am still in that rent-stabilized apartment. I was able to raise those 2 small children, both of whom have graduated college and one who is in medical school in Los Angeles. Now that is the power of rent stability and rent affordability. And the Bronx has 100,000 of the almost 1.5 million rent-stabilized apartments in New York City. And I speak from the perspective of working-class New Yorkers who are being pushed out and priced out of the communities where we laid our roots, all because of unjust and unaffordable rent increases. So let's be clear, the data shows clearly that landlords are not hurting. They have layers of LLCs and management companies that protect their profits, and they sit on portfolios that ballooned during the pandemic recovery. Meanwhile, hundreds of tenants like myself and the tenants that I organize with and I speak to on a daily basis, seniors, single moms, essential workers, we're rationing food, medications, and basic necessities just to pay our rent every month. And every year, the landlords come before this board, claim hardship, and tell you they need higher rents in order to fix their buildings and that are in disrepair. And these landlords get their increases. As a matter of fact, 9% worth of increases in the past 3 years. However, those increases have not led to better living conditions for tenants. They just lead to more evictions, more overcrowding, and continued disrepair with broken elevators, moldy ceilings, and sometimes no heat or hot water during the winter. So if rent increases actually ensured landlords would fix their buildings, the Bronx would be in perfect condition by now. Now, one of the many buildings that CASA organizes is located at 1187 Anderson Avenue in the Bronx. And for years, those tenants complained of faulty plumbing, mold, pest infestations. There were multiple fire department rescues from stalled elevators. And these tenants actually took their landlord to court. And they reached a settlement that included mandated repairs. Instead of making those mandated repairs, the landlord fooled some of the elder and uninformed tenants into signing affidavits claiming that they had received the repairs. These are the kinds of landlords who benefit when you raise the rents. They stall and delay repairs and needlessly drag tenants through housing court. And that's just one of the hundreds of stories that we hear from rent-stabilized tenants that we help at CASA. As I said earlier, you'll hear a lot of data today, and it all substantiates this board's own data, which proves what tenants have been saying for years, that landlords are not in crisis, tenants are. Rent-stabilized landlords' profit last year was 12%, and that's up 2% from the year before. Tenants don't have profit margins. We have rent burdens. As our comptroller just indicated, your own income and expense study showed that rent income rose 6.9%, and operating costs rose 3.8%. So in other words, landlords brought in significantly more money than they spent. And those rising operating costs were already factored into the rent hikes that this board approved last year. So these numbers don't support another increase. If anything, they demand relief for tenants. The cost of rents is skyrocketing very fast. And unfortunately, wages haven't followed. In fact, tenants are earning less, some tenants are earning less than they did a few years ago. In the Bronx, where so many of us work in frontline jobs, nurses, executive assistants, clerical workers, that gap is devastating. And a rent increase now does not reflect the reality of what tenants can afford. The data doesn't justify it, and our communities cannot survive it. The Rent Guidelines Board wasn't created solely to increase rents. It was created to make adjustments. And sometimes those adjustments are meaning recognizing when the burden is too much, right? And choosing sometimes to freeze the rent, to protect the people that keep this city running, like myself. Rent stability gave my family a fighting chance, and other families across our great city also deserve a fighting chance. The same chance that I had to raise your children with dignity in safe homes and without the constant fear of displacement. Tenants need a rent freeze. We deserve that much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions from the board members?
Great, thank you for
Thank
your
you so
testimony.
much.
I was going to say, I wanted to ask you quickly.
Yeah.
Do you know, I want to ask both the tenant and landlord folks this, of, a preference between, for what the ratios should be between, in general, between 1 year and 2 year increases. When, I feel like it's sort of an arbitrary process, but, from a tenant perspective, is there a preference for 2 year leases versus 1 year leases? Do you prefer those be the same rates on both, or I'm just curious
Yes.
about how people.
Yes, we prefer 0% on 1 year and 2 year leases.
right.
For the next 4 years would be really nice. We would really appreciate that, because we really need a lifeline. Tenants are really, really suffering right now. The landlords have gotten increases for the past 3 years in a row, 9%, and some of them were historic. So a 0.0 and 0.0 on 1 and 2 year leases. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much
so
for your
much.
testimony.
Yeah, thank you. I think also to answer you a little bit more, I think when tenants have been given the opportunity to have lower increases on the 2 year, they prefer the long-term leases because they are likely to stay in their apartments for longer. People want stability, right? But when you propose an increase of 5% or 7% on a 2 year lease, they are likely to sign the 1 year, right? And maybe end up displaced from the community. So I think, similar to what HPD said, what we need as rent stabilized tenants is just steady increases. And in order to do that, I agree with HPD, we need to look back and adjust, the rent increases based on the NOIs. But that has not happened historically, right? So something that we should be doing. I'll now call Sam Stein from the Community Service Society of New York.
Welcome, Sam. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. All right. Thank you for inviting Community Service Society to testify before the Rent Guidelines Board this year. As the board considers a rent adjustment that will be fair, both fair for tenants and sustainable for the rent-stabilized housing stock. My name is Samuel Stein. I prepared this testimony with my colleague Oksana Mironova. We're both housing policy analysts at the Community Service Society of New York, or CSS. CSS is an independent nonprofit organization that has been addressing the most urgent issues facing low-income New Yorkers for over 180 years, including the city's chronic housing unaffordability crisis. As data-driven researchers, we appreciate the thorough work done by the board staff to provide members with voluminous reports about long and short-term trends for rent-stabilized housing across the broad diversity of owners and tenants in New York City. There is so much data, however, that board members may be justifiably overwhelmed by the sheer mass of facts and figures. In our testimony this morning, we will highlight the most salient facts, drawing from RGB reports, as well as from our own annual survey of housing and economic security, formerly called the Unheard Third, which is the longest-running scientific poll of a low-income community in the United States. Rent regulation is the backbone of affordability in New York City, protecting over 1 million apartments from unchecked rent hikes. rent-regulated apartments house low-income tenants as well as Black and Latino New Yorkers at higher rates than other forms of housing, and they provide tenants a stability not found in the unregulated housing market. According to our analysis of the 2023 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, 37% of low-income households, defined as those earning less than 50% of AMI, live in rent-regulated apartments, totaling 434,300 households. That is nearly 3 times as many as those living in public housing and subsidized rentals combined. Latino and Black New Yorkers rely on rent regulation more than any other racial or ethnic groups, and for these groups, it is the most common housing arrangement. 38% of Latino and 29% of Black New Yorkers live in rent-regulated apartments. While homeownership is more common among white and Asian New Yorkers, 19% of white households and 16% of Asian households are rent-regulated tenants. Our 2024 annual survey of housing and economic security found that 22% of rent-stabilized tenants were behind on rent. Among rent-stabilized tenants, 17% have been evicted or moved out of fear of being evicted in the past, while 13% experienced a formal or informal eviction attempt in the past year. According to the board's income and affordability study, economic conditions for tenants are dire and by many metrics are declining. While the board's price index of operating costs considers price increases for landlords, it is crucial to remember that inflation and price gouging are also hitting tenants who have lower incomes, lower saving rates, and fewer financing options than most owners. New York City's consumer price index rose 3.8% over the previous year, outpacing the national increase of 2.9%. Inflation so far in 2025 is running at 4.1% compared to 3% at this point last year. The income and affordability report showed a particularly alarming jump in electricity costs, which rose 12.3% in 2024 on top of a 4.7% increase the prior year and with a 13% rate hike projected for this year. Looking over the long term, the income and affordability study shows that from 1968 to 2024, the full span of our current rent stabilization system, rents went up 1,017%, while costs for all other measured goods rose 826%. We often hear that New York's housing affordability crisis is reflective of a nationwide housing crisis, which to some extent it is, but over the same period nationally, the gap between rent and other costs was notably smaller, 870% for rent compared to 801% for all else. New York City rents have risen far faster than wages. As a result, today 46% of rent-stabilized tenants are rent-burdened, 5 percentage points higher than market-rate renters. Among rent-stabilized tenants earning under 50% of AMI, according to the HVS, a staggering 84% are rent-burdened. This year's income and affordability study also showed a slight rise in unemployment, the first recorded since 2020. Unemployment filings today are 5 times higher than they were in 2019. Perhaps most alarming of all, inflation-adjusted earnings for New Yorkers are down 0.4%, compounding last year's 1.8% decline. This year's drop in real wages amounts to $240 less in annual take-home pay for the median rent-stabilized household, who also must pay $486 more in rent thanks to last year's one-year RGB rent increase. Given all of the above, it is distressing but not surprising that personal bankruptcy filings jumped nearly 14% for New York City residents in 2024, representing the second straight year filings have increased. Meanwhile, cash assistance cases rose for the 5th consecutive year, now exceeding 500,000 households, an alarming 66% increase from 2019. Emergency grants, including one-shot deals for rent arrears, hit their highest level since the 2008 financial crisis. For many tenants, the end result of declining economic conditions and rising rents is homelessness. The New York City shelter population rose 8.6% in 2024, the 3rd consecutive annual increase. This rise in homelessness tracks for long-term New Yorkers as well as recent arrivals, and at an average of over 87,000 people per night, more than triples the 1990 average. If the past year saw worsening conditions for tenants, it also saw an improving outlook for landlords. According to this year's income and expense report, the most comprehensive look into the landlord's books provided to the board, this year saw the highest increase in owners' net operating income on record, up 12.1% from the previous year, which was already up 10% over the year prior. And while core Manhattan saw the biggest boost, up 23.1% over last year, 83% of the city's community districts saw rent-stabilized NOI improve, with one of the biggest leaps coming from the South Bronx. Rent collection rates rose 6.9%, reaching highs not seen since 2015, with increases in every single community district in the city. Increases in NOI are not just a year-to-year phenomenon. Since 1990, inflation-adjusted NOI has grown 48%. Meanwhile, looking at historical housing and vacancy survey data, tenants' real income rose just 19% during that same period. It can be confusing to read these banner NOI headlines against the findings in the mortgage survey report, which showed declining sale values for rent-stabilized buildings. These divergent trends represent two aspects of the multifamily real estate market in the wake of the 2019 Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. Pre-HSTPA, rent-stabilized building prices were inflated by speculative purchasers and lenders who gambled on how high rents might go once units were removed from rent stabilization. HSTPA helped realign sales prices with actual rent rolls. As the past 2 years of high NOIs show, buildings can still be quite profitable within the post-HSTPA rental market without the incredibly inflated and ultimately unsustainable sales prices we saw in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. In the future, more reasonable building sale prices will mean more reasonable capital expenses, including lower debt service. Similarly, the price index of operating cost report can be mistaken for countervailing evidence against the income and expense report, but this is also not the case. As the RGB's executive director, Andrew McLaughlin, said during his presentation, in times of economic uncertainty, landlords often delay purchases, leading to a divergence between PIOC predictions and future income and expense report findings. This is a clear historic trend, and there's no reason to expect these chaotic times will produce a different result. Last year's RGB adjustments were in line with the 2024 PIOC's net revenue commensurate adjustment, which is supposed to approximate the adjustment necessary to keep NOI constant for a single unit. But instead, this year's income and expense report showed NOI rising a historic 12.1%. NOI growth was not commensurate, it was explosive. For several years, when introducing the commensurate rent adjustments, the RGB staff has dutifully stated that these are not recommendations for this year's guidelines. Nevertheless, the press, and particularly real estate publications, continue to report them as such. But commensurates would be a very strange metric to use as a benchmark for landlords' economics because they are premised on a pure hypothetical, the economics of a single rent-stabilized unit. No landlord owns just one rent-stabilized apartment. The smallest operator owns 6, and as Just Fix will attest, most rent-stabilized apartments are in portfolios larger than 1,000 units. The largest single factor in the PIOC is taxes, a cost landlords cannot defer indefinitely. They can, however, apply for the newly revived J51R tax abatement, which is designed especially for landlords of low-cost rent-stabilized housing, particularly as they seek to meet the climate requirements mandated by Local Law 97. We expect a great many owners of older rent-stabilized buildings will use this important program in order to defray their biggest annual cost. And I'll add here, because Dr. Gupta mentioned tax reform before, we recently put out a big report advocating for tax reform along the lines of the Lander Plan. While landlords on the whole are doing quite well, we do not dismiss the fact that some buildings are financially distressed. According to the income and expense report, just over 9% of buildings with at least one rent-stabilized unit are classified as such. This, however, represents a nearly 10% decline from last year and falls at the historical median for financial distress over the past 35 years, from a low of roughly 5% in 2016 to a high of nearly 14% in 1990. The geographical locus of financial distress in the rent-stabilized stock is Manhattan, and this year Manhattan also saw the greatest decrease in its share of distressed buildings. The primary driver of financial distress in rent-stabilized housing is unsustainable debt levels. This is a large part of the reason why the greatest levels of distress are found in some of the city's hottest residential markets. As discussed earlier, rent-stabilized buyers were, for a long time, willing to pay much more for their buildings than the rent rolls commanded because they and their banks assumed they could engineer ever-rising rents and could always find new tenants willing to pay more to live in the locations they controlled. In these cases, landlords banked less on RGB increases than compounding vacancy bonus and overpriced individual apartment improvements, which would eventually push rents past the deregulation threshold. With those loopholes in the rent laws now closed, some landlords find themselves operating at a loss and confronted with the options of selling for less than the purchase price or paying their banks and neglecting their buildings. This is not an issue that RGB rent increases will ever resolve. It must instead be dealt with through mass debt restructuring, state and city subsidy programs, and/or preservation purchases by mission-driven nonprofits, landlords, and tenants. In the kinds of rent-stabilized buildings we believe board members are most concerned about, those where the source of distress is a mismatch between rents and costs, another RGB rent hike is still not the solution. In such buildings, rent may seem low compared to citywide asking rents, but they are often in line with market rates for unregulated apartments in the same or nearby buildings. The rents for these units are what they are because tenants, rent stabilized or market rate, cannot afford to pay more, and those who can pay more are not seeking to live in those locations or buildings. Recall that more than 1 in 5 rent stabilized tenants have already fallen behind on rent at the current rent levels. Raising the rents will not solve the problem of poverty and segregation. It will only lead to more evictions and homelessness. Fortunately, landlords have many options for investing in their buildings that don't involve rent hikes. Both the city and state offer a menu of low-interest loans, grants, and tax incentives to help owners retrofit and operate their rent-stabilized buildings. These programs are accessible to nonprofit and for-profit landlords alike. They include the aforementioned J51R program, which offers an as-of-right real property tax abatement for rehabilitation of rent-stabilized properties. The soon-to-be-relaunched Landlord Ambassador program, which in the past provided technical assistance, vacant unit repair assistance, and up to $50,000 per project at 3% interest rates per year to complete emergency repairs and pay back municipal arrears. The Participation Loan Program, which offers 30-year below-market rate loans with partial to full tax exemption for rental building rehabilitation. Depending on the terms of the agreement, PLP subsidies range from $40,000 to $90,000 per unit. The Multifamily Housing Rehabilitation Loan Program, which provides rehabilitation loans up to $35,000 per unit for the replacement of major building systems in multifamily buildings, including roof and window replacement, building envelope work, local law 11 and pointing, and upgrades to the heating, electrical, and plumbing systems. The New York State Multifamily Energy Efficiency Program, which provides incentives for the installation of energy-efficient equipment and technology. The New York City Accelerator Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, or PACE, which finances energy efficiency and renewable energy programs in rental buildings. It offers long-term fixed-rate financing covering up to 100% of project costs with no cash upfront from the owner. The Multifamily Buildings Low Carbon Pathways Program, which incentivizes energy upgrades to major building systems with incentives ranging from $700 per unit for heating and water systems to up to $5,300 per unit for upgrades to the building envelope. And I'll add unlocking doors, which Controller Lander mentioned as well. The data presented to the board members so far is capacious and it is not yet complete. Taken together, however, the data paint a clear picture of improving conditions for landlords and declining conditions for tenants. Net operating income shot up at a historic pace while real wages fell. In these chaotic times, tenants simply cannot afford a rent increase, and landlords as a whole do not need one. For these reasons, we recommend that the board institute a rent freeze. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Questions for Sam? Alex?
Thanks very much, Sam. On page 2, you say that the most recent survey found that 22% of stabilized tenants are behind on rent. Do you have similar figures for other parts of the housing stock, including public housing? I'm just curious how much it differs.
Yeah, I don't have it on me, but I can get it to the board.
And one other question, it's actually maybe for Andrew. If I remember correctly, Mark, the RGB definition of financial distress has to do with the relationship of operating costs and income. It doesn't reflect financing costs. Is that correct?
Where expenses, O&M expenses outpace the income of the
Right. So you were saying that distress relates to debt service, but I don't think the index really does that.
Fair point.
Alex?
Yeah, thank you.
Alex A.
Yeah, Alex A., thank you. Thank you for testimony. I wanted to ask you if you have a view on how the path of rents relative to the purchasing power of a dollar, relative to inflation over time, should move. Like, if we were to do a freeze every year, then the path of real rents would be determined by just what the Federal Reserve does with monetary policy. So, like, in some, like, when inflation is 9%, then real rents are -9, but if inflation is 2% at target, then, real rents are -2. So sort of like, what should the relationship, basically, what do you think the path of real rents should be, rather than just nominal?
Yeah. I mean, some rent stabilization systems have a direct formula, looks at local CPI and adjusts. That's not what the legislators in New York did. They said to look at multiple features, including inflation, including cost to landlords, including cost to tenants. I think Tim's presentation in a little bit is going to look at long-term RGB rent increases compared to inflation and other things, and we'll show that rent increases have outpaced actual cost to landlords. So part of the argument is year to year. Let's look at last year to this year, but part of it is very long-term. And over the long term, inflation has hit landlords and tenants, but rent increases have outpaced those costs.
Yeah, Reed?
Thank you, Sam. This might just be a reformulation of Alex's question, but putting aside all of the data presented to us, the historical data, the current data, conceptually, under what scenarios do you think a rent increase would be justified?
Conceptually, under what? Right, okay. If the distress in the rent-stabilized housing market was not segmented to a small share, but was generalized, sure. If there was a subsidy program that could help low-income tenants at a higher level. So we're fighting right now for the Housing Access Voucher Program, a new voucher created by New York State that would basically match the terms of Section 8, which only covers a quarter of the people who, tenants, very low-income tenants could remain whole. That would help. We don't have either of those conditions. Distress, as shown by the board, is 9%, I believe, and tenant poverty is not at all met by public programs.
I just want to ask you about your analysis of sales data, Sam. You mentioned that HSTPA helped realign sale prices. But when you look at the last couple years, so kind of once that maybe is washed out, you still see significant reductions on sale prices on average per unit basis. What do you attribute that ongoing reduction to?
Well, it's not like every landlord offloaded their buildings right, in July 2019. So some of this is when mortgages are coming up and landlords are sell, or whatever conditions are making landlords want to sell at a given time. We also have this sort of absurd situation for all of us where 6 months after HSTPA passes, the worst pandemic in 100 years hits, and it hits everywhere. So we see a lot of the same conditions in other places that we're seeing in New York City. So it's sometimes hard to disaggregate what's COVID, what's HSTPA, what's a generalized housing crisis in the city for 100 years.
And do you at all have concerns about who might be buying these buildings at these wildly depressed prices?
Yeah, I mean, we've advocated for social or preservation purchases, whether that's a nonprofit, a for-profit, the tenants themselves, people who are committed to maintaining them as rent-stabilized buildings rather than milking them for whatever they can, demolishing whatever. We put out a report basically as this was happening right in 2020 called Corporate Windfalls or Social Housing Conversions, saying that there's going to be this mortgage crisis and the city, state, and federal government should step in, and that this has happened before. I live in one of the city's first HDFCs, went into receivership in '79, went to the tenants in '81. It's been financially stable ever since. So that's the kind of intervention that we're looking for.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much.
Testimony.
Calling now Maxwell Alston from Just Fix. Thank you.
Give them now, thinking coming up, show them. I'm not saying do it. We should distribute that data because it actually helps.
All right, thank you so much for the invitation to Just Fix to testify today.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, my name is Maxwell Austinson. I'm a senior software engineer at Just Fix, which is...
Maxwell, do you mind
Oh,
talking
yeah.
a little bit
Yeah,
more
no
into the mic? Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you. My name's Maxwell Austinson. I'm a senior software engineer at Just Fix, which is a small nonprofit that uses technology to build tools to help tenants assert their rights. We are focusing our testimony today on looking at portfolios of rent-stabilized properties. So with that, so each year there's a lot of concern raised about small mom-and-pop owners or about financial distress for a small subset of buildings in specific areas of the city. And those concerns are often used to argue for across-the-board rent increases for all rent-stabilized properties. However, when we zoom out and look at the data on landlord portfolios for rent-stabilized buildings, we find that 83% of stabilized units in New York City are owned by large corporate landlords, not small mom and pops. And furthermore, over half of all rent-stabilized units in the city are in portfolios that span multiple areas of the city, meaning that even if in some buildings in the portfolio in particular areas are in distress, these can be offset by greater profits in other parts of the portfolio. So for some background, JustFix built a tool called Who Owns What that helps to identify the actual owners of residential buildings in New York City by aggregating and linking public records. So our data is sourced directly from the New York City's open data portal, the same source that's used by the city, like HPD and the Public Advocate. So landlords are required to register their ownership information with HPD, and are also required to report the number of rent-stabilized units within each building to DHCR, which are then reflected on their city property tax bills. We take the data from there and for the rent-stabilized units, and in conjunction with our Who Owns What tool to map landlord portfolios, we're able to analyze the size and nature of landlord portfolios that own rent-stabilized units in New York City. And so with this data, we've done some analysis, and according to that analysis of the portfolio data, we find that 83% of rent-stabilized units are held in large portfolios of over 100 units, with 52% in portfolios with over 1,000 units. Only 12% of rent-stabilized units are part of small portfolios with less than 50 units. With rent-stabilized housing so heavily concentrated in these large portfolios, we can see that a lot of the much discussed mom-and-pop landlords are not really a representative picture of the typical owner of rent-stabilized apartments. And while we can see that the vast majority of rent-stabilized units are in large portfolios, we also find that a majority of stabilized units are in portfolios that span two or more of the board's geographic units, so the boroughs as well as like the split between core and non-core Manhattan. So citywide, 65% of all rent-stabilized units belong to portfolios that span at least two of these areas. And looking only at rent-stabilized units in buildings that are 75% stabilized, so these high concentration of stabilized units in the building, looking just at those units where there's often greater concerns about financial distress, we find still that 64% of stabilized units in those types of buildings are still in portfolios that span multiple areas. So for example, in the Bronx, where specific concerns have been raised this year about financial distress of high percentage rent-stabilized buildings in that area, the statistic is actually even higher. So 67% of rent-stabilized units in those buildings belong to portfolios that span multiple areas. So to summarize, we find that rent-stabilized units, even those in buildings with a high percentage of stabilized units and in areas of special concern for financial distress, they're overwhelmingly part of large and geographically diverse portfolios. So understanding that nature of the portfolios, we can see that even if owners have some properties that are in distress, this can be offset within their portfolios by other properties in other areas with different circumstances where they might be reaping large profits. So given these large and geographically diverse portfolios that dominate the rent-stabilized housing, conclusions cannot be drawn about the entire stock just from a study of the financials at a kind of unit or building level, as the impacts on landlords can be balanced out across all of the properties that they own. And so if there's a small subset of buildings facing financial distress, those issues should be addressed in a more targeted solutions tailored to those specific conditions, but they cannot justify a universal rent increase for all rent-stabilized tenants. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? I think everybody has questions since we're first time we've heard from you, so we really appreciate you coming and talking about these issues. I'll start at the end, and then Christine.
Comment, I guess it's more comment than a question. Each building has, it acts almost like a mini corporation, right, in and of itself, has its own mortgage, has its own tax profile, has its own ownership structure. So when you're saying that if an owner owns 10 buildings, he should take from his Avenue A building and give to his Avenue C building, or how are you justifying that because an owner owns more than one building, he shouldn't be entitled to a rent increase, or he should be entitled to a rent freeze?
Well, I'm making the point that if the concern is that, like, without a rent increase, it's like doing kind of a special harm to the landlords of these buildings, and kind of looking just in isolation at the finances of the one, but but that's not the level that the landlord is kind of being impacted more holistically, that they own all of these other properties, and including even like non-rent stabilized properties where profits are higher. So and so if there are these cases that we've talked about in kind of special circumstances, I think as Sam and the comptroller had mentioned before, there's a lot of more like targeted programs that would be more appropriate for dealing with those issues.
Arpit?
Yeah, thank you so much for your testimony, and I really like the website you all have put together as well.
Thank you.
So I agree with Christina that there's a kind of conceptual and economic question of whether building owners should subsidize one building with another one, or whether they should all be treated as standalone economic entities. But first, just on the feasibility of how much resources landlords do have to potentially transfer across units, you talk about obviously the share of stabilized units belonging to portfolios across geography, et cetera. But you also have that broken out by whether or not the other buildings in their portfolio are themselves rent stabilized or market rate, right? Because if a landlord owns 5 rent stabilized buildings, it may be the case that there are multiple different boroughs, et cetera, but if they're simultaneously facing a distress shock, right, then there aren't really resources to transfer across buildings. Even bracketing the issue of whether they should. Whereas if the same portfolios contain a mix of market rate and rent stabilized units, then that might be potentially a different story. So I'm just curious if you've broken out your portfolio calculations by the fraction of remaining building units that are market rate or rent stabilized.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm not in the numbers that I have today, but that's something that we could definitely look at. And yeah, I believe that, I don't want to say too much, but I believe that there is often a mix of properties across these portfolios. But yeah, that'd be something I'd have to follow up on. But yeah, good point.
I wonder if I could jump in with a question. The interesting data, and thank you for your presentation. Have you looked at other sort of correlations? You looked at ownership. Have you looked at, for example, indications of fiscal distress or financial distress? I'm sorry, physical distress. Like, have you scraped like violation data to do some comparisons, or looked at tax data or other data that might help you and us understand not just the correlation in ownership, but the correlation in building conditions and health?
Yeah, absolutely. More so on the physical condition side, that's something that we focus a lot on. Yeah, using HPD violations, complaints, DOB, that sort of thing. Less so on the financial side. It's not as readily available. Even these rent stabilized units, we're having to web scrape out of PDFs from Department of Finance, and would have to kind of do a similar process to get other kind of building level financial information from those documents. And it's not something that we've explored much, but definitely of interest.
Have you looked at violation data over time on some subset of these buildings, and what are you seeing?
We have a bit. I'm not sure I can speak to any exact numbers at this moment, especially kind of tied to these specific rent stabilized portfolios. But it would be definitely something that we could follow up on.
Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Other, I think Alex and then Alex.
Yeah, thank you so
Sit
much.
next to each other. Can we split them apart?
I really appreciate you coming in. We've known about your Just Fix's work for some time, so it's great to actually see it and have it up to date. I have one small question. When you say geographic areas, you mean community districts? Is that
No, sorry. I mean the boroughs plus the split of core and non-core Manhattan, so above and
Okay.
below 97th
So
Street.
boroughs and non-core versus core Manhattan.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good. And I guess I have a question, sort of following up on Christina's question. Is it possible to get some kind of legal opinion on the ability of landlords to sort of cross-subsidize their properties? So in England, for example, housing associations and private owners own all the housing together. They're not separate corporate entities the way they are here in this country. So I just don't know to what degree owners can, cross-subsidize. So if one property is running a deficit, another is surplus, they can shift money around. And for what purpose? I think it'd be really interesting to know what.
You also have different partners in different buildings.
Okay.
So it's not as if you can just automatically take money out from one entity and transfer it to the other.
Separate. So that's getting to my question. So the fact that you have common ownership across different properties, to what extent does that mean owners and partnerships can shift resources around? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect it's a legal question to some degree.
Operating agreements.
Yeah,
if there's
but
cross-ownership.
it would be good, I think, for because this issue does come up a lot, to be able to have an opinion on that, I think. And I do think it's very helpful just to know that most of the portfolio is owned in large quantities, not individual small-scale owners. So thank you.
Yeah, I think Alex, to what Rob was saying, every building is going to have its own set of underlying agreements, which may or may not allow you to. So it's probably not. There's not probably one size fits all as everything in this stock. It's very much varied depending on the type of ownership, family ownership versus a partnership or corporate entities.
So I guess the reason I'm asking is it's a question of sort of the relevance of this point of common ownership. If, what does that really mean in terms of the ability of owners to equalize spending? And I just don't know. But I think having some kind of opinion about that might be helpful if it's possible.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think for for capital markets access, I could imagine a unitary umbrella, it being if the firm has a good credit rating because of its whole portfolio, it'll be, able to, access a loan or access capital markets to, whatever, make a repair in response to an HPD violation or something. But that NOI cross subsidy across buildings is probably probably not. No, but I wanted to ask you I wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for Just Fix NYC. That's something that I used as when I was a rent stabilized tenant that I always recommend to my friends. I hope you guys are consulting with the city on IT procurement. It's amazing that you guys built something that's better than public employees
right,
tell me
yeah,
that
I
they
know,
use
I
your
know.
website
That
instead
is
of the
true.
regular ones. It's great. I'd love to connect you with Jen Polka and the state capacity team in Scannon about how to fix local IT procurement. But then I just wanted to ask about what do you think about like the idea of what if there was a mechanism? I've heard people talk about the idea of connecting different rent increase allowances to the state of HPD violations outstanding. And there's like a variety of ways you could imagine doing that, but basically it would require a long idle rulemaking power of the RGB that hasn't been used before. But what do you? I was wondering what you think about the idea of if there were a way to restore a link between quality and violations and allowed guidelines. Like, is that something you think would be interesting? You know, from and is the what you make of the HPD violation data?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess maybe my question would be in the sense of proving that they need a rent increase because conditions are poor, or as a...
Imagine a rulemaking that was like,
that I wouldn't...
You know, you're allowed to recover inflation if you haven't had hazardous violations outstanding in the last, some imaginable period. I haven't nailed down a specific, but I'm saying imagine a relationship restoring a relationship, whether through a carrot or a stick, between violations outstanding. Like, in other words, providing an incentive for landlords to be, good landlords, while also, providing the means to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting proposal. I'm not sure I have a fully kind of thought through response, and wouldn't want to kind of like prematurely say anything about it. But yeah, I appreciate the provocation.
If I could jump in on that, because I think that connecting violations to rent increases, there's a whole other subset of problems. Access, the nature of the repairs, whether there is money to do the repairs. I know there's been some discussion within some of the members of the board regarding that. So I think that it creates a bigger problem, or it's not creates a problem, but there is a problem even quantifying that.
Last question, because this is fascinating. I think, and we're all data geeks. I think a little bit, so digging in is really helpful. The HPD registration data sometimes is mixed. Are you able to parse out where the registration is a management company versus the owner?
Yeah, so we look, for each registration, they list a number of contacts. And so you have spaces to give the management. We look only at the ones that are classified as owner. So whether it's a corporate entity, they then have to give a head officer of the corporation that owns the property, as well as sometimes there's an individual or joint owner. So we're looking only at those records. I mean, there is a possibility that landlords are not putting the accurate information of who of the actual landlord's information, and instead they're kind of lying and putting management company information in those fields. There's not too much that we can do specifically.
If they were, you wouldn't get the kind of data you're seeing. In some ways, I have a feeling. If they would trying to hide ownership,
right? Yeah, I mean,
wouldn't get the kind of correlation of portfolio size and ownership that you're seeing. So
yeah, that's we believe it's.
But you're sort of parsing it out. You're actually looking only at the ownership field, and then at the entity that's the owner, and then the address to make sure that they all sort of match something like that.
Yeah, I didn't get too much into it.
You don't
but
need to get any more detail than
kind
that.
of like network analysis methodology that kind of links all of those together. Yeah.
Just a point of clarification on what you had just said and your response. When you register a new building with HPD, you have to actually provide a copy of the deed. So I'm not sure that there's lying going on. As you said, that they would...
No, I'm saying that it's a difference, like, it's not coming from the deed, it's coming from, like, forms that they fill out on HPD where it says, like, the owner versus the management versus, like, they have all these different fields. So if they're putting a different person, and we definitely see this in some individual cases where you can tell that they've put a name and you might actually recognize it, and from a person in the building, they'll say, oh, actually, that's, the management company in some cases, but it is, like, entered by the landlords for those different fields, and it's not directly from the deed.
Both Both things are required, the corporate entity name and the property manager.
Yes,
Either
yeah.
that's a management company or that's an actual property manager's name. Both things are required, and in my experience of clients registering, re-registering, or even after a building sells, the deed is required so that the corporate entity name that owns the building has to be given to HPD.
Yes, no, I agree. But we're also looking at the head, so when they register it as owned by a corporate entity, they also have to then provide information about the head officer of that company as well as their business address, and that's that as well as when it's an individual owner, we're looking at those fields, and so it's not directly from the corporation listed on the deed.
Well, often buildings are single-purpose LLCs.
Yes, yeah.
So, 123 Smith Street
Yeah,
LLC.
almost all of them.
So you then go, exactly, then you go to the next level to look at the corporate officer name and the
Yes.
address of the,
That's right, yeah.
so you have sort of a,
Yes, yeah, when it's owned by a
because if
corporation,
you
we're
just look at
looking
the
at the head
LLC,
officer.
you're not going to
is-
get a match.
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting.
Just to follow to that, help me parse through this discussion, is the implication of that then this 83% might actually be an undercount of the concentration?
It could be, yeah, very, very well.
We're assuming an undercount or an overcount, likely more in each one.
Yeah, it's difficult to guess, but that would be my, my expectation, yeah.
To the extent it'd be an overcount, would that be because of joint ventures and minority interests? Right, like you're mapping multiple LLCs to the same office, but in fact, there's only a junior partner or something in multiple deals, and so but you would assign that all as part of the one portfolio?
So for each building, we're taking like one contact. So usually it's that the building's owned by a corporation, and then they list a single head officer, and we use that contact information. So it actually would be, yeah, even more of an undercount if there's kind of shared interest in buildings, and they happen to list only one of them, and so we're not connecting it to other ones that the second partner who's unlisted might be on. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate it. Oh, I'm sorry.
Couple of questions. So you define 100 units as a large portfolio? Is that just something you guys decided is a large portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, the exact words, but we provide the kind of the size ranges a bit. I mean, you can see that, most of them are over 1,000, so, but, yeah, there's not like a
Right, but
official definition of large.
that in theory could have, one building in it.
It could, yeah.
Okay.
But a large one.
And then, so you have it by units, but do we know actually by owners? Like, it's a representation of 83% of rent-stable units are held in large portfolios, but how many of the owners or entities out of all the owners of all the buildings is something completely different, correct?
Yes, yeah, that would be, a different figure, yeah.
Okay. And when you link different, like you take the name of the person that they list as the author, is there a way that it's a management company rather than actually an entity that owns the building?
Yeah, only if the people in charge, like that own the building, are putting in the wrong information. So in the head officer or the individual owner field, if they're putting a person that is not actually the owner and it's the management, that would be the only way that would happen. But we're kind of limited to the quality of the data that HPD provides and they maintain, and I don't know that there's a whole lot of oversight necessarily into how those fields are filled out. I don't know that there's any independent verification of the information, but yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Very interesting.
Tim Collins from Dupkins and Millers LLP.
Thank you, and good morning.
Morning. Thank you for coming, Tim.
Good to be here for the, I think, maybe 23rd or 24th time.
Do you have a chart on that, Andrew?
I was just thinking. No, that's just this year. Yeah. You only got one this year, you got two last year. You know, I was just thinking that before I came up here, when as a newly minted law school graduate and on my first job at HPD, I might have actually been an intern for a brief, well, I was an intern for a brief period, but it may have been the first day of my internship. In 1986, I was shuffled off to the Rent Guidelines Board hearing at Police Plaza. And I sat there, you know, watching this wild scene unfold, thinking that, you know, I'd really like a quiet office and be a good distance away from this insanity. But they ended up assigning me to do the Rent Guidelines Board contracts, the funding contracts at HPD, and, you know, sort of overseeing what was going on financially with the board. And then in 1987, I became legal counsel and shortly thereafter executive director. And I served in that position, in both positions, for 7 years. And you've seen some of the work that I've done subsequent to that, because I was later contracted to sort of do a history of the board and the introduction to the board, which has been updated by the staff for many, many years. So that's my background for those of you who are new. I want to first amplify Brad Lander's thanks to the board. I have sort of an unusual perspective here, and I think it's commendable that Brad Lander came here and spoke positively of a board which is viewed very negatively very often. And it's hard to commend a board when you're taking an advocacy position. And I'm here to advocate for tenants. You will see that my position is very clear. But I think that, and I do think, you know, there's this perception of generalized dysfunction. It's all politics, it's, you know, and I've had debates about this, and there are certainly some reasonable discussions to be had about how the board is appointed. I mean, you all come through the mayor. Some people want, you know, city council review, et cetera. You know, I think that's a worthy discussion. But you're here, and what you do is look at a tremendous amount of information. You consider a tremendous amount of testimony. It's a very well-structured process, and I've always commended Andrew and the staff for really doing outstanding work, building on things every year, getting greater detail. It is light years away from where we were in 1987, when the board used to be presented with individualized reports. In order to get real income and expense data, we had to go to the Attorney General's office to get co-op filings, because they happen to have income and expense information in them, so that we could structure this really absolutely abysmal surrogate to understand what's going on in the real world. We also had the price index, which, as the most recent report shows, was grossly off for many years. I think up until, I don't remember the year that it changed, about 10 years ago, I think it was improved, but it routinely overstated actual costs. And, you know, once we got access to the income and expense data from the Department of Finance in 1990, we were able to check and make sure that we reformed it. But this kind of process is difficult for the same reason a lot of democratic processes are difficult. You have to navigate through a lot of paradoxes. And I'll just name a few. Tribalism. There are different groups, different interest groups, different affinities. Tribalism can be toxic. It can be a form of discrimination, marginalization. It can lead to destabilization. Tribalism can also be positive. It can be benign. It's a form of identity, community, and belonging for people. It gives them a sense of place and a platform to engage in the rest of the world. So there's a paradox. Power, arbitrary power versus accountable power. There's power that exploits, that oppresses, that subjugates, and we've seen some evidence of that in the last 100 days. And there is power that's accountable, that's responsive to the people democratically, and which allows people to organize, to act in unity, and to exercise, you know, an organizational control over things that benefit the community. So power is good, power is bad. Economic ordering is interventionist, non-interventionist. When you intervene, you're cramping somebody's liberty. You're limiting the way people make private decisions. You may be stifling innovation. You may be stifling investment. At the same time, you may be checking unfettered markets that will exploit and profiteer and fail to account for spillover costs and fuel class divisions. So you have to navigate through all of these different paradoxes. Much of our political discourse and public and policy issues involve navigation through these paradoxes. And the work of this board is one of the best examples. And as I said, I think this is something not to be criticized or to be, constantly scrutinized in a negative way, but actually to be celebrated. I wish there was more celebration of boards like this that have to take on these difficult tasks and do it on behalf of the public. I don't agree with everything the board's done. I mean, that's very clear, and I'll go into that. But again, I think the presence of the board as a human check on a very difficult market is a very positive thing. You have to confront, and this year you're certainly confronting a blizzard of data. I mean, that's already been mentioned. I'd like to, since I have 45 minutes, I thought I was going to have 15 minutes, by the way, so you're going to get the long version. I'm sorry, so I hope you're all, ready for this. But I'm going to be a little pedantic and perhaps a little sophomoric in some ways, but just bear with me. Reed had asked about conceptual thinking about the rent guidelines process, how we address this. And I just want to I want to talk about that in somewhat of a counterintuitive way. As a young undergraduate, I was an economics major. I once had a conversation with one of the top professors in my department. And I said, look, we have all of this information, supply and demand, all of this tremendous data, looking at how markets work. How do we forge this into the best public policy? It's conflicting. There are good economies that reach different conclusions. There are famous quotes about that. And he said, the first thing you must do is take a look around you. And I walked away from the conversation thinking, well, what the hell does that mean? Isn't that what we do when we study stuff, when we gather data? Isn't that what we're doing, taking a look around us? And I think what he was doing was cautioning me against analytical myopia, getting too much information that allows you to get lost or to connect dots in ways that may be misleading in a broader, more conceptual way. And I want to share with you something that's a little bit lengthy, but I have the time, so I'm going to do it. And it's a kind of a cautionary tale, especially for this board at this time, given what you're doing. It's certainly something that challenged my self-confidence about analytics. And I'm going to be presenting very analytical stuff to you in a bit. But I want you to put some of it in context. It's an excerpt from from a book by Amy Chua, Yale law professor, called Political Tribes. She examines the problem of groupthink. And I've always known that humans rationalize and think instrumentally. I mean, it's actually an American school of philosophy, pragmatic instrumentalism. And so I've always recognized that. And certainly you witness that whenever you have hearings. The Rent Guidelines Board invariably hears, and over the years, I heard hundreds, probably thousands of tenants testify and owners testify. Invariably, tenants say the rents have to be kept low or frozen. Invariably, owners testify that the rents have to go up. The owners are looking out for their own profitability. The tenants are looking out for affordability. And the board is stuck with the problem of concerning these issues, but also sustainability, which is certainly clear. So here's the excerpt. It's very telling. She said, groups not only shape who we are and what we do, they can also distort our perception of objective facts. Can intelligence or education overcome these distortive tendencies? It appears just the opposite is true. In one recent study, Dan Kahn of the Yale Law School and his co-authors took a pool of more than 1,000 subjects, testing them first for their political leanings and their numeracy, that is, math and data skills. He then gave all of the subjects a tricky problem, requiring analysis of fictional quantitative data. Some subjects were asked a politically neutral question, whether a new skin cream made a rash better or worse. They were shown a table with numbers that would allow them to evaluate the claim. Predictably, the subjects with stronger numeracy skills tended to come up with the right answer more often. Other subjects were given the exact same numbers, but were asked whether a gun ban increased or decreased crime. Subjects who saw those numbers demonstrated political bias. Those with liberal democratic leanings tended to conclude that the gun ban decreased crime. Those with conservative Republican leanings tended to conclude that a gun ban increased crime. But here's the kicker. Those with stronger numeracy skills demonstrated more bias. They were more likely to err in the direction of their political predispositions, possibly because of their superior ability to manipulate data. In other words, Kahn found that the smarter you are with numbers, the more likely you are to manipulate evidence to conform to your group's core beliefs. This finding has now been replicated for several different hot-button factual controversies, for example, climate change, and extended beyond numeracy. The better informed people are, and the better educated, the more polarized they tend to be on politically controversial factual issues, and the more stubbornly they manipulate new facts to support their tribe's worldview. Point is that if you are bright and you can handle numbers well, you have a richer constellation of dots to connect. And it's somewhat instrumentally in the interest of serving the ends that you're trying to reach. So, I spent many, many years looking at data, gathering data, trying to figure out what it is the board was supposed to do and what it is the board had done and whether or not the board's information was reliable. And the best I could do was ask somewhat of an abstract question, but I think it's a telling one and it's a critical one. And that is, what is it that the board needs to do in order to keep owners whole for changes in operating costs and inflation? Now, to address Alex One's question about how do you factor in inflation and so on, and I address it in this submission, it's a little bit tricky, and it's often lost, and it's often misrepresented. I've seen it in court filings before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, where owners will come before the court and say, operating costs went up 300%, but we only got a 200% increase. This is a taking. They're taking our property. What they don't say is that operating costs, or the operating cost component of rent rolls is only a fraction. It's about 62% using the adjusted data from that Andrew and the staff have put out. Which means that in order to keep owners whole in nominal terms, you have to increase rents. But if you have a price index of, say, 10%, you would have to increase rents 6.2%, because that would increase. That is the portion of the rent rolls that actually goes to operating costs. I've explained it in more detail. It's a little nuanced, but basically, when we talk about the commensurate rent adjustment, and the staff does this, they apply the cost increases to the cost portion of the overall rent roll. And so you basically would increase rents by 62% of whatever the actual cost increases are. To keep the net operating income portion constant, you would increase that by the consumer price index. So you got these two things. Now, it's important because, and I have the numbers here, the price index has gone up like 260-something%, I think, since 1990, since we have numbers here, whereas the consumer price index has only gone up about, I don't know, I have the numbers, it's about half that much, a little more than half that much. So in other words, the operating cost portion would have to be increased at a faster rate than net operating income, which would not result in a dollar-for-dollar increase in rents based upon the percentage increase in costs. And you would end up keeping owners completely whole. That's what's behind the commensurate adjustment that's done every year. And what I do in this table is I attempt to look at the, and if you look at page 11 of what I circulated here, you can see it. It's the second of the last column, which starts at a base of 100, and it takes this commensurate rent formula that is a combination of actually I&E data, because we can look back and look at actual figures, times the cost to income ratio, which is ranged from, you can see 63 back in 0.63 back in 1991, 0.62 in 2024, and multiplying that, the cost increase by that ratio gives you the CPI increase, gives you the cost, the increase that is necessary to cover costs in nominal terms. And then you multiply the consumer price index times net operating income, and that will give you the rent increase necessary to preserve net operating income against the effects of inflation. And combining all that together, you get to the second of the last column, which shows necessary cumulative increases that would be needed to keep owners whole for changes in operating costs and preserve net operating income against the effects of inflation. So we can see that it goes from a base of 100 to 328.16 at the bottom, and that's second to last column. That's a 228.16% increase necessary to keep owners whole. The last column is the rent index. Now, it's important to point out what this is and what it's not. This is not the rental income reported on the I&E data, which is higher. This is a formula that is based upon what the board itself actually approved in terms of 1- and 2-year increases, and it also includes vacancy allowances for the years that vacancy allowances were allowed, which was up until, I believe, 2019. So incorporating those rent increases, we can see that the board has authorized a total of 236% in increases since 1990. So we can see, and this number is getting closer together. There's fascinating things at various intervals in these two columns. For example, you can see that in 2009, necessary increases were basically flat. The owners really didn't require an increase, but they actually, the combination of guidelines that were authorized and vacancy allowances gave them a 7.46% increase. So there was this, and there were a couple of years in which this happened. There was this vast overcompensation of owners at the worst possible time, in the heart of the recession. Tenants were getting killed, and homelessness was rising, and evictions were rising, and the board was not really paying attention to what what was happening in economic reality. I think the price index at this point in time was off considerably because of the effects of the recession and kind of distorting what owners actually spent. And so the bottom line is, and something Andrew pointed out a few years back, in 2008, they were pretty close. The amount needed to keep owners whole had gone up 107.75%, and the amount authorized by the board had gone up 108.36%. So they were practically matched at that point. But then, as I said, the distortions that occurred after the Great Recession and at various intervals since then caused the gap to grow to a point where, I'm just looking for example, we had in 2016, it would have been 147% or 148% needed to keep owners whole, and the board had authorized 187%. So it was like a 40% gap. So since then, things have been brought back closer to balance. Now, here's what I need to say about this. These are very conservative numbers. This is the most conservative approach to setting rents, to keep owners completely whole. it says that owners can't suffer from economic transitions and, strange things going on in the markets, but that tenants can. And during this period, we witnessed a huge increase in rent burdens and in the level of homelessness. Things are starting to change in some respects, but the consequences of this really were unforgivable. They were unnecessary, unforgivable, and they are still baked into the base rents. Let me say a few things about some of the other issues that were raised.
Are you open to interruptions and questions?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
well, you're the chairman. You can,
Well, thank you for that. So, sort of to your point, I'm not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing, just using your data, which we've talked about in past years. So like sort of towards the peak of that gap between those two columns, call it 2000, I think I'm looking at 17 or 16, where it was close to 40-point difference.
Yeah.
Acknowledging, we're probably not going to always agree on this, but just using that technical framework, it's now an 8-point difference.
Yeah.
So in less than 10 years, that gap is significantly reduced.
Yes.
What does that say to you? And I'll sort of use Reed's context. When does that gap make a difference in the rent setting decisions of this board?
Well, I think the gap already has made a difference. I've been presenting this data now. I don't remember if I had developed this in like 2013 or 14, but I was apoplectic. I was shrill. I was practically screaming at the board at that time.
Well,
saying,
maybe that made a difference because obviously there's been a huge reduction in that gap.
I was presenting
so back
this
to my
data.
question. What does that mean?
Yeah,
And how should we use
that's
that?
exactly where I'm going. I was presenting the data, and I was saying you have to step on the brakes because you really overshot the mark, and they did. During the de Blasio years, they stepped on the brakes. There were a number of rent freezes. Of course, the pandemic had its effects, and I think the board properly took into account the anomalous human consequences of something that was out of the ordinary. And so we have gone in the right direction, very slowly, from my perspective. Now, here's the problem and the implicit assumption that may be behind your question, which is, 10 years seems like a short amount of time and we're going in the right direction. 10 years is 10 years too long. Those numbers should have come down right away. Owners were being overcompensated in a very big way. It was coupled with vacancy deregulation, which was occurring, and this gets to your other question that you had asked earlier. You spoke with Brad Lander about, I'm not sure you got a full response about the decline in sales prices. And that is, we went through a period of incredible speculation and a great deal of instability. It was driven by deregulation. It was also driven by excessive rents that were being authorized by this board. And the consequences in terms of homelessness and rent burdens were very clear. So in 2019, democracy struck back. Albany said, enough is enough. We've got too many people on the streets. We've got too many people who can't afford their rents, and we're going to make a change. One of the primary legislative goals of the HSTPA 2019 was to address, and I'm quoting, severe disruption of the rental housing market resulting from, quoting again, deregulation of housing accommodations upon vacancy, which resulted in, quoting again, speculative and profiteering practices and has brought about the loss of vital and irreplaceable affordable housing for working persons and families. The decline in property values that you're seeing, to some degree, and it's not, and I will talk about the weaknesses of that data, and that data is very weak, was engineered. It was an effort to slam the brakes on speculation and profiteering that was disrupting the market. This was intentional. Buildings in some ways were overvalued, and owners were paying prices for buildings not based upon what the rent rolls were, but based upon the anticipated value of moving a lot of those tenants out, getting vacancy deregulation, and increasing the rents. And so we had a bubble. and the bubble has burst. It was somewhat disrupted by.
Jump in on that one.
I just wanted to follow, before we get into like the valuation question, I just want to follow up on Doug's point about your table itself.
Yeah.
Because I think the change is maybe a little bit more rapid than you'd indicated with the 10-year number, because if I just look at this chart, so if I go back to 2020, so the first year after HSTPA, there's a 40% gap between the necessary rent increases and the impact of the RGB rent index starting from 1990, right? So that's a 40% gap. The next year that goes to 30%. The next year that goes to 20%. The next year that goes to 16%. And then in the most recent data, that's now 8%. So over the past, 4 or 5 years, the gap between the cost increases as you compute them and the RGB's increases, which post HSTPA don't include that vacancy adjustment. This is just what Doug said, is that gap seems to have slowed dramatically. So you asked the board to put on the brakes, and it seems like the board did. And so I just want to repeat Doug's question, because I want to know the answer, which is at what point you then put on the accelerator. Right? Like, do you think we should aim at zero? Do you think we should go negative?
I think negative would be fine. What I'm saying is that the assumption that it has to be positive in every instance or even equal is a highly conservative assumption.
Why do you say that, Tim? Why
It's
is
a
it
highly conservative assumption because.
I mean, you mean conservative in a
rent setting.
In a rent setting context.
In a rent setting context, because
obviously.
what you're saying is that despite the hardships that are going on, despite the increase in rent burdens, despite the increases in homelessness and housing eviction cases, we are going to myopically focus on ensuring that owners do not lose. And what happened was owners gained more than they should have, and the board should have not tapped the brakes, but slammed on the brakes then, because it was having consequences going forward, still having deleterious consequences. 10 years was too long.
What should we do now? Right?
So right now, it's still a situation where owners are historically overcompensated, that they've, things have, net operating income has been preserved. And there's another discussion in here, which I will go into, which goes into, I won't go into detail, it's in here. But that is, we know from this year's reports, for example, and actually I have some questions about this data, Andrew, that I think really need to be examined. You have a pre-1974 average net operating cost to rent ratio of 62, and then you have a post-74 ratio of 67. I don't understand where the post ratio, post-74 comes from, because we don't have that much post-74 housing, and when you boil it all down, you get a 62% O&M to rent ratio. But I just want to, I think that needs to be looked at, because I have some questions about it. But it does show, and all of the evidence from studies over the years, the RAND Corporation and others who've looked at housing operating cost profiles. Older housing have higher operating cost to rent ratios. They cost more to maintain. So back in the late 1960s, when they were looking at the rent-controlled stock, the operating cost ratios were, in some cases, 75 and 80%. That's all old pre-war stock. The new buildings, post-47 buildings, were 0.55. So older housing costs more to operate. What you're missing, and I've mentioned this in probably for 7 or 8 years now, is information about the relative aging of the stock since the beginning of our analysis in 1990. In other words, if the average rent-stabilized building today is 20 years older than it was in 1990. Now remember, there's units that come in under the 421A program, and there's some units that go out because they're abandoned and so on, but I believe that on average, the stock has aged. The consequence of an aging stock in a normal market, which is what you really should be trying to simulate, and I know it's almost impossible, but that's what your goal should be. The consequence of an aging stock would be a gradual, slight rise in operating cost ratios. So having an operating cost ratio now of 0.65 or 0.67 would be fine, which means that these numbers, the balance here would shift somewhat, so that the board would offer, would not be increasing rents at the same rate, because you would allow the operating cost ratio to rise, which is now at 0.62 on average. And we have a blind spot. We don't know what the exact, the average age of a rent-stabilized building is today compared to where it was in 1990.
Well, certainly for the older stock, we know it's older.
Yeah.
Forget the sort of.
Yeah.
And to me, what you just said is potentially, we don't know, and this is something we've talked about a lot, is indications of deferred maintenance, because where are you going to cut your costs to stay with a constant O&M, right? You're going to cut your day-to-day maintenance costs, and there's some indications of that. We don't see it yet in the distress of the stock, but I feel like you're sort of saying because it's been constant, owners were overcompensated. I'm not so sure I can make that corollary. And by the way, I just want to do a time check. We got 10 minutes, Tim.
Okay, that's fine. I think,
And other questions, or people have questions. So let me let Alex jump in on a question.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, you just hit on exactly what my question was. Like, so 421A in the 1970s was a 10-year phase-in. We've lengthened 421A more and more, and so it's, the essentially new market rate housing is staying,
Right.
it enters and remains in the stabilized stock for longer. And so I was going to ask you, that's where, like, this, although I think this is conceptually correct, I feel like you would want to calculate this for maybe the pre-74 stock or whatever you could get data for, because otherwise, if you treat the cost-to-income ratios and the NOIs of the entire stabilized stock as a unitary whole, then that means that new, very high NOI buildings are entering this calculation. And so, like, 30,000 completions last year, the 421A share of those completions mean that...
let me, I think this...
would mean more new
I
buildings
think-
means we have to cut rents for old buildings, is basically what this would imply.
I think this will answer your question, and that is the last column is not a measure of how much rents have increased or income has increased. It doesn't include high rent buildings at all. The last column is a measure simply of what this board has authorized.
Right.
So in comparing the two, you're not looking at anything that from the change in the stock that would affect the last column. That's just what the board is
definition of
authorized.
necessary, when you multiply the O&M ratio and the NOI times CPI, that NOI is coming from a changing stock. So, like, if 500,000 421A units, if I poofed them into existence tomorrow, this NOI ratio would go to the moon, right?
The NOI, the cost-to-income ratio would certainly go down.
That would go down and the NOI ratio would go up.
Well, the NOI portion, yeah, would go up, yes. That's absolutely true. But the problem is that, if you want to fragment the stock and analyze it in detail, which is fine, you can do that, but adopting specialized rent increases can be problematic, very difficult. And remember, you're operating off a scale that, for lower income buildings, or for, I shouldn't say lower income, buildings with lower rent rolls or lower cost buildings, they started off at a lower base, so they're coming up. But look, let me actually mention one other thing too, because I don't want to lose it. You mentioned connection violations with rents. That's actually been looked at by I believe, the Corp Council many years ago, and I think it's outside the board's jurisdiction, but Andrew could double check that. And I think that there is an advisory opinion of some kind. But look, I think that what this says is that what the board has done, to the extent, it's acted in a kind of a unitary fashion, it hasn't bifurcated or fragmented its orders. What the board has done has more than kept owners whole at a time when those numbers, the 228% needed to keep owners whole, and the 336% that was granted, the 236% that was granted, that last figure probably should have been lower. It certainly should have been somewhat lower. The consequence for this board today is that you're looking at housing that was overcompensated by your own decisions, that the guidelines were excessive, they're coming closer together, but we're not there yet, and the assumption that they have to be together. In other words, using this table as sort of a normative benchmark for setting rents would be a mistake, because there are other things happening in the universe, as I said, the aging of the stock, and the very assumption that owners need to be kept whole in all respects, while tenants have certainly suffered an immense decline in affordability. In 1970, the beginning of the system, the average rent burden was 20% of income. Today, it's in the mid-30s. That's happened nationwide to some extent, but it's far worse in the city.
Can I just follow up on this point? So I just want to understand conceptually how you think the board, should or might operate in the future. So suppose next year that this gap goes down to 0%. So we still have the legacy of past increases, but now there's no gap between what it was in 1990. And then suppose you take your adjusted cost to income ratio and allow that to, increase up to whatever you think is an age-adjusted number, 65, 67, whatever, right? Do you then think the board should pass future adjustments that mirror that statistic? Or if not, what other method do you think we should adopt to incorporate rental burdens and so forth?
This rolls us right back to the beginning of what I was trying to get at, which I perhaps didn't do very artfully, and that is if there was a formula that could be applied. We should have a formula and not a board. There's a board here because the universe of housing and tenant problems and owner problems is complex. I mean, we had the Great Recession, we had the pandemic, we have some things going on out there that really do need to be looked at. Distressed property, and I mentioned it here, is a serious issue. But where's the distress coming from? Is it coming from the fact that the rents are too low, the legal rents are too low? Or is it coming from the fact that tenants can't afford to pay the rents that are allowed? And are these owners suffering huge collection losses? And will rent increases do anything for these owners when, in fact, it may just push more tenants out of their buildings? It's complicated. And that's what I meant about, being careful about analytical myopia. Even these numbers, and this is about as myopic as you can possibly get. I mean, I tried to take everything you do and stick it into a couple of columns. And now I'm telling you that even these columns should not be a ministerial or a mechanical directive for what the board should do. The board has to, consider a lot of different stuff. You've heard a lot of great testimony today. I'm sure you'll hear from the owners. Distress is a big issue. I've often said that the board should exercise its authority. You're probably some of the best informed housing analysts in the city in terms of taking a global view of what's going on. And you have different voices that bring the different impacts to bear, in terms of evaluating real consequences, in terms of on the stock, sustainability, affordability, and profitability. You should use your ability to adopt resolutions and say, Albany City Hall, we're really concerned about this 9% of the housing stock that seems to be reporting that they're treading water. And we need reforms. Is it tax reform? Is it targeted rent subsidies? But we don't need reforms that, force us to drive into a river to get out of the rain. We don't need to raise rents for 90% of the stock in order to deal with this 9%, which in some of that may be transitional. Some of it may be collection losses. Some of it may be deliberate decisions on the part of owners not to rent units while rehab is going on. There's a lot of stuff in there that we don't know about. And again, with respect to setting the rents in a way that has historical continuity, we don't know what the relative age of the stock is and how it's changed. I know it's gone up. I just don't know precisely how much. And I think that information can be garnered by, possibly by examining housing and vacancy survey data directly. The other thing that we're lacking, and I think it's important to point out, especially when getting back to the drop in sales prices. The sales price data is from the mortgage survey. It looks at the change in prices upon sales for those who either refinance or, buy a new building. It's about 500, I think, buildings, I think, typically in a year, which is, I think, less than maybe 1 or 2% of the housing stock. So, and we don't know, I don't know how they crunch these numbers, whether they're interfamily transfers or, whether there are things in there that might statistically distort what is happening. Clearly, there's a drop. Clearly, from my perspective, it's a product of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. Clearly, the back of speculation and the kind of predatory equity that was driving things up has been broken by this legislation, and that's what was intended. That doesn't mean that it's not a concern. It's a concern if we're going to lose housing. If you lose housing, you're not going to house people. I don't think anybody here from the tenant side is going to say, lower these rents to the point where owners walk away. That happened in the 1960s for a number of reasons. One of them was very severe and strict rent control. It wasn't the only reason. There were other dynamics at work. And we don't want to see a repetition of that. So, that's the reason why I compliment the board. I think the board, by and large, has done the right thing. It just, in the last 10 years, it's been too slow, and it's been somewhat one-sided.
Well, I want to thank, because we're getting to the end. Any last questions for Tim?
So I've just been looking at the table, and I'm struck that, and comparing the CPI increase to your index of RGB rent increases, which I appreciate combines 1-year, 2-year leases, and vacancy allowances when they were permitted. And it's interesting to me that until 2017, the RGB increase always exceeded the increase in inflation in the CPI. Even during the de Blasio years when there were rent freezes, the rent increase overall, the RGB exceeded inflation. But since 2020 to 2024, the RGB increase has been less than inflation. And that's the first time we've had consecutive RGB increases that are less than the inflation increase.
Yep.
And so it means that there is, as I understand it, that the RGB increases are in real terms, a decrease. I guess I'm wondering how you interpret that and what that would mean in terms of the ability to maintain the housing stock.
Well, look, this is one of the problems with trying to isolate and look at things in the abstract. Again, this rent index, the cumulative rent index over the years, is a measure of what the RGB authorized. The reality is, and the staff has amply documented this, is that net operating income has gone up 48% in inflation-adjusted terms since 1990. So notwithstanding that the board is kind of getting things right and getting closer to the mark, the other things that have happened in the market, deregulation, MCIs, individual apartment improvements, and to a large extent some illegal improvements, or rather increases, have caused rents to go up. The reality is, aside from what the board has authorized, that owners are doing very well. 48% increase in net operating income since 1990 suggests that buildings that were purchased for a reasonable price should be returning a solid return. Where owners, I think, are suffering, again, my suspicion is a lot of it has to do with collection losses.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Tim, as always, for your testimony, for your thoughts, and for your wisdom on this subject. Thank you. So I think with that, we're going to take a break.
Yeah, we reconvene at 1.
Great.
There is lunch in the room over there, which you can bring in here and eat if you'd like. If you do step out, we ask that you be back by 1. So, anyway, thanks.